transformation of Horus Lupercal from the Emperor's most trusted son into the architect of the galaxy's greatest betrayal began not with a single moment of corruption, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign of manipulation that exploited the War Master's deepest fears and resentments. The seeds of this corruption were planted during Horus's recovery on the moon of Davin, where the insidious influence of the Chaos Gods first took root in his wounded psyche. When Horus fell to the anathema blade wielded by the possessed Yugen Temba on Davin's moon, the wound proved beyond conventional medical treatment. The weapon, forged in the warp and blessed by the ruinous powers, carried a poison that attacked not just flesh but the very soul. As the War Master lay dying aboard his flagship, the vengeful spirit, his desperate sons sought any means to save their Gene father. It was then that Erebus of the Word Bearers, serving as an advisor to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, presented what appeared to be their only hope: the healing rituals of Davin's Serpent Lodge. The lodge itself represented a perfect fusion of the warrior lodge system that had spread throughout the legions and the ancient chaos cults that had long festered in the shadows of human civilization. These warrior lodges, ostensibly fraternal organizations that transcended the rigid hierarchies of the legions, had been carefully cultivated by Erebus and his fellow word-bearers as vehicles for corruption. Within the lodges, Astartes from different companies and even different legions could meet as equals, sharing grievances and doubts that would never be voiced in official channels. The Serpent Lodge on Davin took this concept to its logical extreme, blending the brotherhood of warriors with the worship of powers that promise strength beyond mortal limitations. The lodge's inner sanctum, carved from the living rock of Davin's surface, pulsed with barely contained warp energy. Ancient symbols covered the walls, their meanings lost to all but the most dedicated students of forbidden lore. The air itself seemed thick with possibility and menace, charged with the attention of entities that existed beyond the material realm. As Horus's body was brought into this sanctum, the ritual began. The lodge members, their faces hidden behind serpentine masks, chanted in languages that predated human civilization. The words seemed to bypass conscious thought, speaking directly to primal fears and desires. Incense burned in braziers carved to resemble coiled serpents, filling the chamber with smoke that induced visions and lowered the barriers between reality and the immaterium. Within this charged atmosphere, Horus's consciousness was drawn into the warp itself. The experience transcended anything the Primarch had previously encountered, even during his earliest memories of awakening on Thonia. In the realm of pure thought and emotion, Horus found himself confronted by visions that seemed to reveal the true nature of the galaxy and his place within it. The Chaos Gods did not appear to Horus as the monstrous entities they truly were. Instead, they manifested as aspects of concepts he could understand and even admire: strength, ambition, perfection, and knowledge. They spoke to him of the Emperor's true nature, painting the master of mankind not as a benevolent father figure, but as a cold manipulator who viewed even his Primarch sons as nothing more than tools to be discarded once their usefulness had ended. These whispers found fertile ground in doubts that had already begun to take root in Horus's mind. The Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade to pursue mysterious projects on Terra had left many questions unanswered. Why had the Master of Mankind abandoned the conquest of the galaxy at its most crucial juncture? What could be more important than the work they had begun together, father and son, to unite humanity under a single banner? The visions showed Horus glimpses of Terra, where the Emperor worked in vast laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace. The Chaos Gods whispered that these were not mere scientific endeavors, but preparations for apotheosis. The Emperor, they claimed, sought to ascend to godhood, while leaving his sons to bear the burden of ruling a galaxy that would worship him as a deity. The Primarchs, for all their superhuman abilities, would become nothing more than high priests in a cosmic religion dedicated to their father's glory. These revelations struck at the core of Horus's identity. Throughout his life, he had defined himself through his relationship with the Emperor. He was the first Primarch found, the most trusted, the one chosen to bear the title of War Master when the Emperor departed. Yet now he saw this favoritism in a different light. Had he been chosen for his loyalty rather than his merit? Was he nothing more than the most reliable of the Emperor's servants, valued not for his own worth, but for his willingness to follow orders without question. The corruption that seeped into Horus's soul during those critical hours was not a crude possession, but a subtle transformation of perspective. The Chaos Gods did not force new thoughts into his mind, but rather amplified existing doubts and resentments, twisting them into something darker and more destructive. They showed him visions of a future where humanity was united not under the Emperor's tyrannical rule, but under the leadership of those who truly understood the galaxy's harsh realities. Erebus, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to ensure that the corruption took hold. The first chaplain of the Word-Bearers had spent decades preparing for this moment, studying the nature of chaos and learning how to channel its power without becoming consumed by it. His own fall had been gradual, beginning with his legion's humiliation at Monarchia and culminating in their pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror, where they had learned the truth about the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem. The warrior lodges had been Erebus's masterpiece of manipulation, a network that allowed him to identify and influence potential converts across multiple legions. Within these supposedly egalitarian brotherhoods, he had carefully planted seeds of doubt about the imperial truth and the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. He spoke of the hypocrisy of denying the existence of gods, while the Emperor himself wielded powers that could only be described as divine. He questioned the wisdom of suppressing all religion while allowing the imperial cult to flourish in all but name on countless worlds. Through the lodges, Erebus had identified those Astartes most susceptible to corruption: the ambitious, the bitter, the questioning. He fed their doubts with carefully chosen pieces of forbidden knowledge, always stopping short of open heresy, but gradually eroding their faith in the imperial cause. When Horus fell on Davin's moon, Erebus had a network of corrupted warriors ready to support whatever course of action the War Master might choose. The War Master's recovery from his wounds marked the beginning of a new phase in his relationship with his father. Outwardly, Horus remained the dutiful son, continuing to prosecute the Great Crusade with his characteristic brilliance and determination. However, beneath this facade, a fundamental shift had occurred. The absolute trust and loyalty that had defined his relationship with the Emperor had been replaced by suspicion and resentment. Horus began to see patterns in the Emperor's behavior that he had previously overlooked or excused. The frequent changes in orders, the mysterious projects that required resources but offered no explanation, the gradual centralization of power on Terra, while the Primarchs fought and died on distant battlefields. Each of these could be explained individually, but together they painted a picture of a ruler who viewed his sons as expendable assets rather than beloved children. The War Master's growing disillusionment manifested in subtle changes to his conduct of the crusade. He began to question orders more frequently, to delay implementation of directives that seemed counterproductive, and to make strategic decisions based on his own judgment rather than strict adherence to imperial doctrine. These changes were gradual enough to avoid immediate censure, but they represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between Terra and the expeditionary fleets. As Horus's corruption deepened, he began to reach out to his brother Primarchs, testing their loyalty to the Emperor and their willingness to consider alternative visions for humanity's future. This process required extraordinary subtlety, as any open suggestion of rebellion would have been immediately reported to Terra. Instead, Horus relied on private conversations during joint operations, carefully worded communications, and the network of warrior lodges that now existed across multiple legions. Lorgar Aurelian of the Word-Bearers proved to be the most receptive to Horus's overtures, though this was hardly surprising given Erebus's role in the War Master's corruption. The Urizen had never fully recovered from the humiliation of Monarchia, where the Emperor had forced him to kneel and watch as his perfect city burned for the crime of worshipping the master of mankind as a god. The Word-Bearers' subsequent pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror had revealed to them the true nature of the galaxy's spiritual dimensions, knowledge that they had carefully concealed from their brother legions. Lorgar's recruitment to Horus's cause was less a matter of persuasion than of revealing shared grievances and common purpose. Both Primarchs had been humiliated by the Emperor for following their nature, Horus for his loyalty and trust, Lorgar for his spiritual devotion. Both had discovered truths about the galaxy that the imperial truth sought to suppress. Their alliance was built on mutual understanding and shared resentment rather than mere ambition. Mortarion of the Death Guard presented a different challenge. The Lord of Death had always been suspicious of authority, having spent his youth fighting against the necromancers who ruled his homeworld of Barbarous. His relationship with the Emperor was complicated by the fact that the Master of Mankind had denied him the satisfaction of defeating his adoptive father personally, instead claiming that victory for himself. This intervention, while arguably necessary, had left Mortarion with a sense of incompleteness and resentment that Horus was able to exploit. The War Master approached Mortarion through their shared experiences as military commanders who had been forced to make difficult decisions for the greater good. He spoke of the burden of leadership, of the loneliness that came with command, and of the Emperor's apparent inability to understand the sacrifices his sons made in his name. Mortarion, who had always prided himself on his endurance and his willingness to bear any burden for his legion, found these arguments compelling. The idea that the Emperor might not truly appreciate the costs of the Great Crusade resonated with his own experiences and observations. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children required a different approach entirely. The Phoenician was driven by a desire for perfection that bordered on obsession, and his legion reflected this pursuit in every aspect of their conduct. Horus appealed to Fulgrim's pride and his frustration with the limitations imposed by imperial doctrine. He suggested that true perfection could never be achieved while bound by the narrow vision of the imperial truth, that the Emperor's refusal to acknowledge the full spectrum of human potential was itself a form of weakness. The corruption of Fulgrim was aided by influences beyond Horus's direct control. The Phoenician had recently acquired a sword of alien manufacture, a weapon of exquisite craftsmanship that seemed to enhance his already formidable abilities. Unknown to Fulgrim, the blade housed a demon of Slaanesh, an entity that whispered constantly of greater pleasures and more perfect sensations than any mortal could imagine. These whispers complemented Horus's arguments, creating a symphony of temptation that gradually eroded Fulgrim's loyalty to the imperial cause. Angron of the World Eaters presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The Red Angel's mind had been damaged by the butcher's nails implanted in his skull during his youth on Nuceria, leaving him capable of little beyond rage and violence. However, Horus recognized that Angron's fury was not mindless, but rather the product of deep-seated pain and betrayal. The Emperor had taken Angron from Nuceria just as he was about to die alongside his fellow gladiator slaves, denying him the honorable death he had chosen and forcing him to live with the knowledge that his companions had died without him. Horus approached Angron not through complex arguments, but through simple acknowledgement of his pain. He spoke of the Emperor's callousness in allowing Angron's brothers and sisters to die, while preserving only the Primarch himself. He suggested that the Master of Mankind viewed them all as tools to be preserved or discarded as convenience dictated, that their personal desires and attachments meant nothing compared to their utility in the Great Crusade. The recruitment of these Primarchs was not accomplished through single conversations, but through a gradual process of corruption that unfolded over months and years. Horus was careful to present himself not as a rebel seeking to overthrow the Emperor, but as a concerned son who questioned whether their father's vision truly served humanity's best interests. He spoke of the need for reform rather than revolution, of the possibility that the Emperor might be convinced to change course if presented with sufficient evidence of his errors. This approach allowed the corrupted Primarchs to maintain their self-image as loyal servants of humanity, while gradually accepting ideas that would have horrified them in their previous state. They began to see themselves not as traitors, but as reformers, not as rebels, but as patriots willing to make difficult choices for the greater good. The warrior lodges provided a forum for these ideas to spread beyond the Primarchs themselves, creating networks of corruption that extended throughout their legions. The influence of the Chaos Gods grew stronger as more Astartes fell under their sway. The ruinous powers fed on the emotions generated by this growing conspiracy, the pride of those who believed themselves enlightened, the anger of those who felt betrayed, the ambition of those who saw opportunity in chaos, and the despair of those who had lost faith in the imperial dream. Each corrupted soul became a conduit for warp energy, gradually weakening the barriers between reality and the Imperium in the regions where the traitor legions operated. The warrior lodges that spread throughout the legions Astartes during the latter years of the Great Crusade represented one of the most insidious tools of corruption ever employed against the Emperor's forces. What began as genuine fraternal organizations designed to foster brotherhood across the rigid hierarchical structures of the Space Marine legions became the primary vector through which heretical ideologies infiltrated the very heart of the imperial war machine. The concept of warrior lodges was not inherently corrupt. These informal gatherings emerged naturally from the social dynamics of the legions themselves, particularly among those formations that had absorbed large numbers of recruits from warrior cultures where such brotherhoods were traditional. The lodges served as spaces where battle brothers could meet as equals, regardless of rank or company assignment, sharing experiences and forming bonds that transcended the formal command structure. In many ways, they fulfilled a genuine psychological need among the Astartes, providing emotional support and camaraderie that the often harsh discipline of legion life could not offer. The early lodges were typically organized around shared experiences or common origins. Veterans of particular campaigns would form groups to commemorate their fallen brothers and preserve the memory of their victories. Warriors recruited from the same worlds often established lodges to maintain connections to their cultural heritage while serving in the broader imperial cause. These gatherings involved ritual elements borrowed from the traditions of their homeworlds, including ceremonial scarification, blood oaths, and the sharing of sacred names known only to lodge members. The physical spaces where lodges met varied considerably depending on the resources available and the preferences of their members. Aboard starships, they might gather in unused cargo holds or abandoned sections of the vessel, decorating these spaces with trophies from their campaigns and symbols representing their shared identity. On planetary surfaces, lodges often established meeting places in natural formations or constructed simple structures that could accommodate their rituals. The atmosphere in these spaces was deliberately different from the formal environments of Legion facilities, with dim lighting, incense, and acoustic arrangements that encouraged intimate conversation. Erebus of the Word-Bearers recognized the potential of these organizations long before his corruption of Horus on Davin. The first chaplain possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that had been honed through decades of studying religious and social movements across the galaxy. He saw in the warrior lodges a perfect mechanism for spreading ideas that could never be discussed in official channels, a way to bypass the loyalty conditioning and indoctrination that made direct corruption of Astartes so difficult. The Word-Bearers' approach to infiltrating the lodge system was methodical and patient. Rather than attempting to establish new lodges under their direct control, Erebus and his agents focused on joining existing organizations and gradually assuming leadership roles within them. They accomplished this through a combination of genuine military prowess, charismatic leadership, and careful manipulation of lodge politics. Once established within a lodge's hierarchy, they could begin the delicate process of introducing new ideas and perspectives. The corruption process typically began with seemingly innocent discussions about the nature of the Great Crusade and humanity's place in the galaxy. Word-Bearers' agents would raise questions about the Imperial Truth's prohibition on religious belief, pointing out apparent contradictions between official doctrine and observed reality. They noted how many compliant worlds maintained spiritual practices despite Imperial law, how the Emperor himself wielded powers that seemed divine in nature, and how the Primarchs were revered with an intensity that bordered on worship, despite official disapproval of such sentiments. These discussions were carefully calibrated to avoid triggering the psychological conditioning that protected Astartes from heretical thoughts. Rather than directly challenging imperial doctrine, the Word-Bearers presented their arguments as intellectual exercises or philosophical speculation. They encouraged lodge members to think critically about their experiences and to question whether the official explanations for various phenomena were complete or accurate. This approach allowed corrupted ideas to take root gradually, seeming to emerge from the warrior's own reasoning rather than being imposed from outside. The lodge system's emphasis on equality and brotherhood made it particularly vulnerable to this form of manipulation. The informal atmosphere and relaxed hierarchy encouraged open discussion and the sharing of doubts or concerns that would never be voiced in official settings. Warriors who might never have questioned imperial doctrine in their regular duties found themselves drawn into increasingly sophisticated theological and philosophical debates during lodge meetings. As the corruption spread, the lodges began to serve as recruitment grounds for more serious forms of heresy. Erebus and his agents carefully observed which warriors showed the greatest receptivity to alternative ideas, noting those who asked probing questions or expressed frustration with imperial policies. These individuals became targets for more intensive corruption efforts, receiving private instruction in forbidden knowledge and gradually being introduced to the true nature of the Chaos Gods. The recruitment process was extremely selective and cautious. The word-bearers understood that moving too quickly or targeting the wrong individuals could expose their entire operation to discovery and destruction. They focused primarily on warriors who already harbored grievances against the imperial system, whether due to personal experiences, cultural conflicts, or philosophical disagreements with official doctrine. Veterans who had witnessed the destruction of compliant worlds for minor infractions, warriors whose homeworld cultures had been suppressed or modified to conform to imperial standards, and officers who had been passed over for promotion, despite their achievements, all proved susceptible to corruption. The corrupted lodges also served as intelligence networks, allowing the word-bearers to map the loyalty patterns within various legions. Through careful observation and strategic questioning, they identified which warriors remained absolutely loyal to the Emperor, which harbored doubts that could be exploited, and which had already begun to question the fundamental assumptions of the imperial cause. This information proved invaluable when the time came to plan the purges that would eliminate loyalist elements from the traitor legions. The lodge meetings themselves evolved to accommodate their new purpose as centers of conspiracy. The ritual elements that had always been part of lodge culture were gradually modified to include increasingly heretical components. Traditional oaths of brotherhood were supplemented with pledges of secrecy regarding lodge discussions. Ceremonial scarification began to incorporate symbols that, while appearing to be mere decorative elements, actually represented chaos iconography in disguised forms. The sharing of sacred names expanded to include titles and epithets drawn from forbidden texts that the word-bearers had discovered during their pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. The physical spaces used for lodge meetings also underwent subtle transformations. Decorative elements were introduced that served as focal points for warp energy, though their true nature was concealed from all but the most thoroughly corrupted members. Incense formulations were modified to include psychoactive compounds that lowered mental barriers and made participants more susceptible to suggestion. The acoustic properties of meeting spaces were adjusted to enhance the hypnotic effects of ritual chanting and to create an atmosphere of otherworldly mystery. As Horus's corruption deepened following his experience on Davin, the lodge system became the primary mechanism through which his new perspective spread throughout the legions under his command. The War Master's closest advisors, many of whom were already lodge members, became conduits for his increasingly heretical ideas. They spoke of Horus's growing concerns about the Emperor's true intentions, his questions about the wisdom of the imperial truth, and his belief that the Primarchs needed to take a more active role in shaping humanity's future. The Sons of Horus Lodges were among the first to undergo complete transformation from fraternal organizations to cells of active conspiracy. The warriors who participated in these meetings began to see themselves as an enlightened elite, privy to truths that their unenlightened brothers could not comprehend. They developed elaborate justifications for their growing disloyalty, convincing themselves that they were serving humanity's true interests by questioning the Emperor's vision and supporting Horus's alternative approach. Similar transformations occurred within the other legions, whose Primarchs had fallen under Horus's influence. The Death Guard lodges became forums for discussing Mortarian's growing disillusionment with imperial policies and his belief that the Emperor had never truly understood the sacrifices required by the Great Crusade. The Emperor's children lodges evolved into venues for exploring concepts of perfection and excellence that transcended the limitations imposed by imperial doctrine. The World Eaters' Lodges, despite Angron's limited intellectual engagement, became centers for channeling the Legion's rage toward new targets, including those within the imperial system who were deemed responsible for their Primarch's suffering. The Word-Bearer's role in coordinating these transformations required exceptional skill and discretion. Erebus and his agents had to maintain the appearance of loyalty while simultaneously orchestrating a galaxy-spanning conspiracy. They accomplished this through a combination of coded communications, carefully planned meetings during joint operations, and the use of lodge networks to pass information between different legions. The informal nature of lodge gatherings provided perfect cover for these activities, as discussions that might have seemed suspicious in official contexts appeared to be nothing more than typical warrior bonding. The intelligence gathered through the lodge system proved crucial in identifying loyalist elements within the traitor legions. The Word-Bearers compiled detailed records of which warriors participated enthusiastically in lodge activities, which remained aloof or suspicious, and which actively opposed the new directions their organizations were taking. They noted patterns of association, mapping the personal relationships and loyalty networks that existed within each legion. This information allowed them to predict which warriors would likely remain loyal to the Emperor when the time came for open rebellion. The identification process was complicated by the fact that many loyalist Astartes were also lodge members who had not yet recognized the heretical nature of their organization's evolution. These warriors presented a particular challenge, as they possessed detailed knowledge of lodge activities and membership, but remained fundamentally committed to the imperial cause. The Word-Bearers had to determine which of these individuals might be turned through further corruption efforts, and which represented insurmountable security risks that would need to be eliminated. The planning for the eventual purge of loyalist elements began long before the Istvan system became the chosen location for this betrayal. Lodge meetings served as venues for discussing the logistical challenges involved in simultaneously eliminating thousands of Astartes across multiple legions while maintaining operational security. The conspirators had to consider questions of timing, coordination, and cover stories that would prevent the loyalists from recognizing their danger until it was too late to respond effectively. The lodge system also facilitated the recruitment of mortal personnel who would play supporting roles in the coming betrayal. Ship crews, army units, and mechanicum forces all had their own informal social networks that paralleled the Astartes lodges. Word-Bearers' agents worked to identify and corrupt key individuals within these organizations, creating a broader conspiracy that extended far beyond the Space Marine legions themselves. These mortal conspirators would prove essential in controlling communications, managing logistics, and preventing loyalist elements from escaping or calling for reinforcement during the purges. The transformation of the warrior, lodges from fraternal organizations into instruments of treachery, represented one of the most sophisticated corruption efforts in imperial history. The Word-Bearers had successfully weaponized the natural human desire for brotherhood and belonging, turning it into a tool for spreading heresy and identifying targets for elimination. The lodge system's emphasis on secrecy and exclusive membership made it nearly impossible for loyalist forces to detect the growing conspiracy, until it was far too late to prevent its culmination in the fires of betrayal that would soon consume the Istvan system. The corruption networks established through the warrior lodges had served their purpose in identifying loyalist elements within the traitor legions, but the physical elimination of these warriors required methods that went far beyond conventional warfare. Horus and his conspirators faced a fundamental tactical problem: how to simultaneously eliminate thousands of veteran Astartes who possessed the same training, equipment, and superhuman capabilities as their traitorous brothers. A direct confrontation would result in massive casualties among the traitor forces and potentially allow significant numbers of loyalists to escape and warn Terra of the rebellion. The solution to this dilemma came in the form of weapons so horrific that their deployment would forever mark the War Master's complete abandonment of any pretense of honor or humanity. The Life Eater virus represented the pinnacle of the Imperium's biological warfare capabilities, a weapon system developed during the darkest days of the Age of Strife, when humanity's survival often depended on the complete eradication of hostile populations. The virus itself was not a single organism, but rather a carefully engineered cocktail of synthetic pathogens designed to attack organic matter at the cellular level. Unlike conventional biological weapons that targeted specific physiological systems, the Life Eater virus consumed the fundamental building blocks of life itself, breaking down complex organic molecules into their component elements with terrifying efficiency. The technical specifications of the virus revealed the depth of scientific knowledge that had gone into its creation. The primary pathogen was a modified bacteriophage that had been altered to target not just bacterial cells, but any organic structure containing carbon-based compounds. The virus carried genetic material that hijacked cellular machinery, forcing infected cells to produce more viral particles while simultaneously breaking down their own structural proteins. This process created a cascading effect where each infected cell became a factory for producing agents of its own destruction. Secondary components of the viral cocktail included synthetic enzymes that accelerated the breakdown of organic polymers, ensuring that even dead tissue would not escape consumption. Stabilizing agents prevented the virus from burning itself out too quickly, allowing it to maintain its destructive potency long enough to consume entire ecosystems. The weapon also incorporated delivery mechanisms that allowed it to spread through multiple vectors simultaneously: airborne transmission for rapid dispersal, contact transmission for persistence on surfaces, and even limited survival in water supplies to prevent any refuge from contamination. The effects of Life Eater virus exposure on living organisms were as swift as they were horrific. Initial infection typically occurred through respiratory contact, as the airborne viral particles were microscopic enough to penetrate even the sophisticated filtration systems of Astartes' power armor. Within minutes of exposure, infected individuals would experience the first symptoms: severe respiratory distress as the virus began attacking lung tissue, followed by rapid systemic organ failure as the infection spread through the bloodstream. For baseline humans, death typically occurred within 15 to 20 minutes of exposure, but their suffering was compressed into those brief moments as their bodies literally consumed themselves from within. The virus attacked nervous tissue with particular efficiency, causing excruciating pain as neural pathways were dissolved, while simultaneously preventing the merciful unconsciousness that might have provided escape from agony. Victims remained aware and alert as their bodies disintegrated around them, their screams cutting short only when their vocal cords dissolved. The enhanced physiology of the Astartes provided no meaningful protection against the Life Eater virus. Their superhuman constitution, designed to resist conventional toxins and diseases, proved useless against a weapon that attacked the fundamental chemistry of life itself. Anything, their enhanced metabolism accelerated the virus's effects, as their more efficient cellular processes provided additional energy for the pathogen's reproduction. Loyalist space marines who had survived decades of warfare against Xenos horrors and chaos abominations found themselves helpless against an enemy that consumed them from within. The civilian population of Istvan III faced an even more terrible fate, lacking even the brief resistance that Astartes' physiology provided. The planet's cities, which had harbored millions of Imperial citizens, became charnel houses as the virus spread through population centers with unstoppable momentum. Families died together in their homes, workers collapsed at their stations, and children perished in their schools as the Life Eater consumed everything in its path. The virus showed no discrimination between age, gender, or social status, reducing the entire human presence on the planet to its constituent elements within hours of deployment. Horus's decision to employ such extreme measures was not made lightly, though his justifications revealed the extent to which his perspective had been warped by chaos corruption. The War Master viewed the virus bombing as a surgical strike that would eliminate the loyalist threat without the prolonged warfare that a conventional assault would require. In his twisted logic, the complete destruction of Istvan III's surface was preferable to a campaign that might last months or years, during which time the Loyalists could potentially escape or call for reinforcement from Terra. The War Master's strategic calculations were influenced by his growing paranoia about the Emperor's true intentions and his belief that time was running short for his rebellion to succeed. He had convinced himself that the Master of Mankind was already aware of potential dissent within the legions and was preparing countermeasures that would make future resistance impossible. From this perspective, the virus bombing represented not an act of unprecedented brutality, but rather a necessary preemptive strike that would preserve the element of surprise essential to the broader rebellion's success. Horus also justified the use of life, Eater virus, through his evolving understanding of warfare itself, as shaped by his exposure to chaos philosophy during his corruption on Davin. Traditional concepts of honor and restraint in battle, he argued, were luxuries that humanity could no longer afford in a galaxy filled with existential threats. The Xenos races showed no mercy to human populations, and the entities of the warp recognized no distinction between combatant and civilian. If humanity was to survive and prosper, its leaders needed to be willing to employ any weapon and accept any cost that victory demanded. The technical aspects of deploying life Eater virus across an entire planet required extensive preparation and coordination among the traitor forces. The virus had to be loaded into specialized delivery systems that could maintain its potency during atmospheric entry while ensuring wide enough dispersal to achieve complete planetary coverage. The warheads themselves were marvels of destructive engineering, incorporating multiple redundant systems to prevent premature detonation while maximizing the weapon's effectiveness once deployed. Each virus bomb contained several kilograms of concentrated viral material suspended in a nutrient solution that would sustain the pathogen during its initial dispersal phase. The warheads were designed to detonate at optimal altitude to create overlapping contamination zones that would prevent any surface location from escaping infection. Atmospheric modeling conducted by Mechanicum adepts had calculated the precise detonation patterns needed to ensure that air currents would carry the virus to every corner of the planet's inhabited regions. The delivery systems chosen for the Istvan III bombardment included both orbital bombardment platforms and aircraft-launched munitions, providing multiple vectors of attack that would overwhelm any defensive measures the Loyalists might attempt. The traitor fleets positioned themselves in high orbit to avoid contamination, while their bombardment vessels prepared to unleash their deadly cargo. Fighter bombers from the traitor legion's air wings stood ready to provide precision strikes against any targets that might escape the initial orbital bombardment. The moment of deployment arrived with clinical precision, as the traitor forces executed their carefully rehearsed attack plan. The first wave of virus bombs descended through Istvan III's atmosphere like falling stars, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they plunged toward their designated impact zones. The warheads were programmed to detonate simultaneously across the planet's surface, creating a coordinated release of viral material that would prevent any possibility of containment or evacuation. The initial detonations appeared almost anticlimactic compared to the destruction they would ultimately cause. Unlike conventional explosives, the virus bombs produced relatively small blast effects, creating modest craters and dispersing their contents in expanding clouds of barely visible aerosol. The true horror became apparent only as the viral clouds began to spread, carried by atmospheric currents across continents and oceans with inexorable thoroughness. Within the first hour after deployment, the effects of the Life Eater virus became visible from orbit as entire cities began to undergo rapid decomposition. The organic matter that comprised not just human and animal life, but also plant material, food stores, and even some synthetic compounds began breaking down simultaneously across the planet's surface. Rivers and lakes became contaminated as runoff from dying ecosystems carried viral particles into water systems, ensuring that no refuge remained for any form of organic life. The atmospheric effects of the virus bombing exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of the weapon's designers. As billions of tons of organic matter underwent rapid decomposition, the chemical processes involved consumed vast quantities of atmospheric oxygen while releasing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, and other combustible gases. The planet's atmosphere, normally a life-sustaining mixture of gases, transformed into a volatile cocktail that required only the smallest spark to ignite. The atmospheric ignition began at multiple points across Istvan III's surface as the decomposing organic matter reached critical temperatures through the heat generated by rapid cellular breakdown. The first flames appeared as small fires that might have been mistaken for ordinary combustion, but they quickly spread as the oxygen-depleted, gas-rich atmosphere provided ideal conditions for sustained burning. Within hours, these scattered fires had merged into continent-spanning conflagrations that consumed everything the virus had not already destroyed. The firestorm that engulfed Istvan III created temperatures that exceeded those found in the cores of some stars, turning the planet's surface into a hellscape that defied description. The atmospheric burning consumed not just the gases released by viral decomposition, but also the oxygen reserves in the planet's atmosphere, creating a feedback loop that sustained the fires for days after the initial ignition. Mountains melted under the intense heat, oceans boiled away into superheated steam, and the very rocks of the planet's crust began to flow like liquid. From orbit, the traitor fleets watched as Istvan III transformed from a verdant world into a glowing ember suspended in the void. The planet's surface radiated heat that could be detected by ship sensors from millions of kilometers away, while the atmospheric firestorm created electromagnetic disturbances that interfered with communications and navigation systems. The world that had once hosted millions of imperial citizens and thousands of loyalist Astartes had become a monument to the absolute ruthlessness that Horus was prepared to employ in service of his rebellion. The few loyalist survivors who had managed to reach underground shelters or sealed bunkers found themselves trapped in structures that had become ovens, as the surface temperatures climbed beyond any level that their life support systems could counteract. Those who attempted to emerge from their refuges encountered an atmosphere so toxic and superheated that even Astartes' physiology could not survive exposure for more than moments. The planet's surface had become literally uninhabitable, transformed into an environment more hostile than the void of space itself. The virus bombing of Istvan III represented a watershed moment in the Horus Heresy, marking the point at which the rebellion crossed from political dissent into genocidal warfare. The weapons deployment demonstrated that the traitor forces were prepared to employ any means necessary to achieve their goals, regardless of the cost in innocent lives or the long-term consequences for the galaxy. The precedent established on Istvan III would influence the conduct of the civil war for years to come, as both sides gradually abandoned the restraints that had previously limited the scope of imperial military operations. The bombing of Istvan III had been designed to eliminate every trace of organic life from the planet's surface, yet the weapon's very thoroughness created the conditions that would allow a handful of loyalist warriors to survive the initial genocide. As the Life Eater virus consumed the planet's biosphere, and the subsequent firestorm scoured the surface clean, deep underground installations and reinforced bunker complexes, provided temporary refuge for those fortunate enough to reach them before the atmospheric ignition began. Among these survivors were some of the finest warriors the legions Astartes had ever produced, men whose names would become synonymous with resistance against the War Master's betrayal. Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children had been among the first to recognize the true nature of Horus's corruption, though his understanding came too late to prevent the tragedy that was about to unfold. The veteran officer had served with distinction in the 10th Company for over a century, earning recognition for both his tactical acumen and his unwavering dedication to the ideals that the Emperor's Children had once embodied. Unlike many of his battle brothers who had been seduced by Fulgrim's increasingly obsessive pursuit of perfection, Tarvitz maintained a clear perspective on what that perfection should represent: service to humanity and loyalty to the Emperor above all else. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during the pre-deployment briefings aboard the Pride of the Emperor. Tarvitz had noticed subtle changes in the behavior of his fellow officers, particularly those who had become prominent members of the warrior lodges that had spread throughout the Legion. These warriors, once paragons of the Emperor's children's noble ideals, now spoke with barely concealed contempt about the limitations imposed by imperial doctrine and the need for their legion to pursue excellence without regard for outdated restrictions. More disturbing still were the private conversations Tarvitz overheard between lodge members, discussions that touched on subjects that should have been unthinkable for loyal Astartes. They spoke of the Emperor's failures, of his apparent abandonment of the Great Crusade, and of Horus's superior understanding of what humanity truly needed to survive in a hostile galaxy. These whispers of heresy were couched in language that made them seem like legitimate strategic discussions, but Tarvitz recognized the underlying corruption that had taken root in his legion's heart. The captain's growing unease crystallized into certainty when he witnessed a lodge meeting that had been thought secure from outside observation. Hidden in the maintenance spaces of the Pride of the Emperor, Tarvitz watched as his battle brothers engaged in rituals that bore no resemblance to the traditions of their homeworld or the customs of the Emperor's children. The warriors carved symbols into their flesh that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light, while their chanting incorporated words in languages that predated human civilization. The transformation of his legion from noble warriors into something alien and corrupt struck Tarvitz with the force of a physical blow. Armed with this knowledge, Tarvitz attempted to warn his remaining loyal brothers within the Emperor's children, but he quickly discovered that the corruption had spread far deeper than he had initially realized. Warriors he had served alongside for decades looked at him with suspicion when he raised concerns about the lodge activities, while others dismissed his observations as paranoia or jealousy. The few who shared his concerns were either already aware of the situation or too frightened to act on their knowledge. The captain's isolation within his own legion became complete when he learned of the planned deployment to Istvan III. The mission briefing spoke of a routine compliance action against a rebellious governor, but Tarvitz recognized the signs of a more sinister purpose. The selection of personnel for the deployment seemed designed to place specific warriors in harm's way while keeping others safely aboard the fleet. The loyalist elements within each legion were being systematically identified and marked for elimination. Tarvitz's desperate attempt to warn the loyalist forces on Istvan III's surface began with a carefully planned theft of a Thunderhawk gunship from the Pride of the Emperor's flight decks. The captain had to overcome not just the physical security measures protecting the aircraft, but also the psychological barriers that made it nearly impossible for an Astartes to act directly against his legion's interests. Every aspect of his conditioning and training screamed against what he was attempting, yet his loyalty to the Emperor and his duty to his true brothers overrode these programmed responses. The stolen Thunderhawk's descent through Istvan III's atmosphere became a race against time as Tarvitz pushed the aircraft's engines beyond their safe operational limits. He could see the first wave of virus bombs beginning their own descent, their heat signatures visible on his tactical displays as they plunged toward the planet's surface. The captain's Vox transmissions cut through the routine chatter of the deployment, his voice carrying desperate urgency as he broadcast warnings to any loyalist forces that might be monitoring communications frequencies. Tarvitz's warnings reached the surface just minutes before the virus bombs detonated, providing barely enough time for some loyalist units to reach whatever shelter they could find. His message was simple and direct. The bombardment was not conventional ordnance, but something far more deadly. An immediate underground shelter was the only hope for survival. The captain's Thunderhawk crashed into the ruins of Coral City as the first viral clouds began to spread, but his sacrifice had given hundreds of loyalist warriors the knowledge they needed to survive the initial phase of the betrayal. Captain Garville Loken of the Luna Wolves had been among those who received Tarvitz's warning, though the message only confirmed suspicions that had been growing in his mind for months. The veteran of Ulaner and countless other campaigns had watched with growing unease as his legion transformed under Horus's influence, becoming something that bore little resemblance to the noble warriors who had once been known as the Luna Wolves. The adoption of the name Sons of Horus had been just the most visible sign of changes that ran far deeper than mere nomenclature. Loken's position as one of the Mournival, the informal advisory council that had once provided counsel to the War Master, had given him a unique perspective on Horus's gradual corruption. He had witnessed firsthand the subtle changes in his Primarch's behavior following the incident on Davin's moon, changes that seemed to accelerate with each passing month. The War Master's increasing reliance on the Council of Erebus and other word-bearers, his growing criticism of the Emperor's policies, and his willingness to bend or break imperial regulations in pursuit of his goals all pointed toward a fundamental shift in his loyalties. The captain's attempts to address these concerns through official channels had been met with dismissal or outright hostility from his fellow Mournival members. Tarik Torgadon, once his closest friend and ally, seemed to view Loken's concerns as evidence of inflexibility and an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Horus Aximand and Abaddon were even less receptive, treating any criticism of the War Master as tantamount to treason. Loken found himself increasingly isolated within the very organization that had once been his greatest source of pride and brotherhood. When Tarvitz's warning reached the Loyalist forces on Istvan III, Loken was commanding a mixed force of Luna Wolves and Imperial army units in the industrial sector of Coral City. The captain's tactical experience immediately recognized the implications of the Emperor's Children officer's message, and he began implementing emergency shelter procedures even as his subordinates questioned the wisdom of abandoning their assigned positions. Loken's decisive action saved the lives of nearly 200 Astartes and several thousand army personnel who managed to reach the reinforced underground facilities before the virus bombs detonated. The captain's survival of the initial virus bombing was due in large part to his location within a massive industrial complex that had been built to withstand the seismic activity common to Istvan III's geological structure. The underground levels of the facility extended deep into the planet's bedrock, with multiple redundant life support systems and sealed bulkheads that could isolate different sections in case of emergency. When the Life Eater virus began its deadly work on the surface, Loken and his men found themselves in one of the few locations on the planet capable of protecting them from both the biological weapon and the subsequent atmospheric ignition. The days that followed the virus bombing tested Loken's leadership abilities in ways that no amount of military training could have prepared him for. The survivors under his command included not just Luna Wolves, but also warriors from other legions, Imperial army personnel, and even some civilian refugees who had managed to reach the shelter before the bombardment began. These disparate groups had to be welded into a cohesive fighting force while dealing with the psychological trauma of betrayal by their own brothers and the apparent destruction of everything they had fought to protect. Captain Tarik Torgadon's survival of the virus bombing had been even more miraculous than Loken's, as the former Mournival member had been caught in the open when Tarvitz's warning arrived. Torgadon had been leading a reconnaissance patrol through the outer districts of Coral City when the first viral clouds began to spread, and only his quick thinking and intimate knowledge of the city's layout had allowed him to reach shelter in time. The captain had commandeered a civilian transport and driven it directly through the walls of a reinforced warehouse, sealing himself and his men inside just as the atmospheric ignition began. Torgadon's experience during the virus bombing had been transformative in ways that went beyond mere survival. The captain had always been known for his humor and irreverent attitude toward authority, traits that had made him popular among the rank and file, while occasionally causing friction with more serious-minded officers. The horror of watching his homeworld sky burn, while knowing that his own Primarch had ordered the destruction, stripped away much of his casual cynicism, replacing it with a grim determination to resist the corruption that had consumed his legion. The reunion between Loken and Torgadon occurred 3 days after the bombing, when patrol groups from their respective survivor enclaves encountered each other in the ruins of what had once been Coral City's commercial district. The meeting was emotional for both captains, as each had assumed the other had perished in the bombardment. Their embrace amid the ash-covered rubble of their former deployment zone symbolized not just personal survival, but the persistence of the bonds that had once defined the Luna Wolves' brotherhood. The two captains quickly recognized that their individual survival efforts needed to be coordinated if they were to have any hope of meaningful resistance against the traitor forces that would inevitably come to confirm the bombardment's success. Torgadon's group had managed to salvage significant quantities of equipment and supplies from abandoned Imperial army positions, while Loken's survivors included several tech marines whose expertise would be crucial for maintaining their weapons and armor in the harsh post-bombardment environment. The formation of a unified command structure among the survivors required delicate negotiation, as the traditional Legion hierarchies had been shattered by the betrayal. Warriors who had once served under different primarchs now found themselves fighting alongside former enemies, while officers who had held positions of authority in their respective legions had to work with subordinates from other formations. Loken's reputation for fairness and tactical competence made him a natural choice for overall command, while Torgadon's charisma and ability to maintain morale proved invaluable in keeping the disparate groups focused on their common cause. The survivors' first major challenge came in the form of scavenging operations designed to gather the resources necessary for sustained resistance. The virus bombing and subsequent firestorm had destroyed most of the planet's infrastructure, but some hardened military installations and deep storage facilities had survived the initial destruction. These locations contained weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and other equipment that would be essential for any attempt to fight back against the traitor forces. The scavenging missions required careful planning and execution, as the planet's surface remained extremely hazardous even weeks after the bombing. The atmospheric composition had stabilized somewhat, but toxic gases still lingered in low-lying areas, while the intense heat generated by the firestorm had left many structures weakened and prone to collapse. The survivors had to navigate this hostile environment while avoiding detection by any traitor reconnaissance forces that might be monitoring the planet's surface. During these operations, the Loyalist survivors encountered other groups of Astartes who had managed to survive the bombardment through various means. Some had been fortunate enough to reach shelter in time, while others had survived through sheer chance or the intervention of battle brothers who had recognized the danger. Each new group that joined the growing resistance brought additional manpower and expertise, but also potential security risks if any of their number harbored divided loyalties. The integration of these disparate survivor groups required Loken and Torgadon to develop new protocols for verifying loyalty and maintaining operational security. Traditional methods of identification and verification had become meaningless when battle brothers could no longer trust their own legions, and the survivors had to create new systems based on demonstrated actions rather than formal credentials. Warriors who had actively resisted the corruption within their legions, or who had attempted to warn others of the impending betrayal, were generally accepted without question, while those whose loyalty remained uncertain were subjected to careful observation and limited access to sensitive information. The psychological impact of the betrayal on the survivors cannot be overstated, as these warriors had to confront the reality that everything they had believed about their legions and their primarchs had been fundamentally wrong. Many of the survivors had served for decades or even centuries under the command of the very leaders who had now revealed themselves as traitors, and the cognitive dissonance created by this revelation threatened to shatter their ability to function as effective fighting forces. Loken and Torgadon spent considerable time and effort addressing these psychological wounds, helping their men process their grief and anger while channeling those emotions into determination to resist. The formation of mixed legion units among the survivors represented a radical departure from traditional Astartes organization, as warriors who had been trained to fight as part of cohesive legion formations now had to adapt to working alongside battle brothers from different genetic lineages and tactical traditions. Death Guard survivors brought their expertise in attrition warfare and toxic environments, while Emperor's Children veterans contributed their knowledge of precision tactics and equipment maintenance. World Eater's survivors, despite their reputation for uncontrolled aggression, proved surprisingly effective at close-quarters combat in the ruins of Istvan III's cities. The development of these improvised tactical formations required extensive training and coordination, as the survivors had to learn to work together despite fundamental differences in their combat doctrines and cultural backgrounds. Loken's leadership proved crucial in this process, as his experience commanding diverse forces during the Great Crusade had given him insights into how different military traditions could be combined effectively. The captain's ability to identify and utilize the unique strengths of each survivor group while minimizing the friction created by their differences became one of the key factors in the Resistance's early success. As the survivors established their operational base in the deeper levels of Coral City's industrial complex, the strategic importance of the Precentor's palace became increasingly apparent to their leadership. The massive governmental complex, located at the heart of the city's administrative district, represented far more than just another fortified position. Its symbolic significance as the seat of imperial authority on Istvan III made it a natural rallying point for loyalist forces, while its physical characteristics offered defensive advantages that could not be replicated elsewhere on the devastated planet. The Precentor's palace had been constructed during the early years of imperial compliance, designed to serve as both the planetary governor's residence and the primary command center for imperial military operations in the Istvan system. The architects who planned the complex had drawn inspiration from the great fortress palaces of Terra, creating a structure that combined administrative functionality with defensive capabilities. The palace's foundations extended deep into the bedrock beneath Coral City, with multiple levels of reinforced bunkers and command centers that had been designed to coordinate military operations across entire sectors. The building's superstructure rose nearly 2 kilometers above the city's surface, its armored walls and defensive towers creating an imposing silhouette that could be seen from orbit. The palace's exterior was clad in ceramic plates backed by layers of reinforced rockcrete, providing protection against orbital bombardment and heavy weapons fire. Defensive positions built into the structure's facade housed automated weapon systems and provided firing positions for defenders, while the building's height offered commanding views of the surrounding urban landscape. The palace's internal layout reflected its dual nature as both administrative center and military fortress. The upper levels contained the ceremonial halls and offices where the planetary government had conducted its business, with soaring chambers decorated with murals depicting imperial victories and sculptures honoring the emperor's glory. These spaces, while impressive, were of limited tactical value to the survivors. The middle levels housed the palace's primary defensive systems, including command centers, armories, and barracks that had been designed to support extended siege operations. The lower levels of the palace complex proved to be its most valuable feature from a defensive standpoint. These subterranean installations included multiple redundant power systems, water treatment facilities, and air filtration systems that could sustain thousands of personnel for extended periods. The palace's foundations also connected to the city's extensive tunnel network, providing potential escape routes and supply lines that could be crucial during a prolonged siege. Most importantly, the deepest levels contained hardened communication centers with powerful Vox, arrays capable of reaching Imperial forces throughout the sector. The survivors' reconnaissance of the palace revealed that the structure had survived the virus bombing and subsequent firestorm relatively intact, though its upper levels showed significant damage from the extreme temperatures generated during the atmospheric ignition. The building's defensive systems remained largely functional, powered by geothermal generators that had continued operating throughout the bombardment. The palace's automated defenses had detected the approach of reconnaissance teams, but their targeting protocols could be overridden by personnel with the proper authorization codes. Loken's decision to establish the palace as the Loyalists' primary stronghold was based on both tactical and psychological considerations. From a purely military perspective, the structure offered defensive advantages that could not be matched by any other location on the planet. Its elevated position provided excellent fields of fire across the surrounding city, while its reinforced construction could withstand sustained bombardment from orbital assets. The palace's internal layout, with its multiple defensive lines and choke points, would force any attacking force to fight for every corridor and chamber. The psychological impact of holding the precentor's palace was equally important to the survivors' morale and their broader strategic objectives. The building represented the continuation of imperial authority on Istvan III, a visible symbol that the emperor's rule had not been completely extinguished by the traitor's betrayal. For the loyalist Astartes, many of whom were struggling with the psychological trauma of their legion's corruption, the palace provided a tangible connection to the oaths they had sworn and the cause they continued to serve. The movement of survivor groups to the palace required careful coordination to avoid detection by any traitor reconnaissance forces that might be monitoring the planet's surface. The Loyalists moved in small groups during periods of reduced visibility, using the ruins of Coral City to conceal their movements while avoiding the open spaces where they might be spotted by orbital surveillance. The survivors' knowledge of the city's layout, gained through their pre-bombardment deployment, proved invaluable in navigating the transformed urban landscape. The palace's occupation by Loyalist forces began with the establishment of security perimeters and the activation of the building's defensive systems. Tech-marine specialists worked to restore damaged equipment and optimize the structure's defensive capabilities, while tactical squads established firing positions and observation posts throughout the complex. The survivors' limited numbers required careful deployment to cover the palace's extensive perimeter, with automated systems supplementing human defenders in areas where manpower was insufficient. The traitor force's response to the Loyalist consolidation at the precentor's palace marked the beginning of a new phase in the Istvan III campaign. Initial reconnaissance flights by traitor aircraft confirmed that significant numbers of Loyalist survivors had gathered at the palace, presenting Horus's forces with a tactical problem they had not anticipated. The virus bombing was supposed to have eliminated all resistance on the planet's surface, but the continued presence of organized Loyalist forces threatened to complicate the War Master's broader strategic objectives. The traitors' first attempts to eliminate the palace garrison relied on orbital bombardment from the fleet assets positioned above Istvan III. However, the survivors had anticipated this response and had taken steps to minimize their vulnerability to such attacks. The palace's defensive shields, powered by the building's geothermal systems, provided protection against all but the most concentrated bombardment. More importantly, the Loyalists had positioned themselves throughout the structure in ways that made it impossible to eliminate them without completely destroying the building, something the traitors were reluctant to do given the palace's symbolic importance. The failure of orbital bombardment to dislodge the Loyalist garrison forced the traitor commanders to consider more direct approaches to eliminating the resistance. The deployment of ground forces to assault the palace would require significant resources and would likely result in substantial casualties among the attacking troops. However, the continued existence of organized Loyalist resistance on Istvan III posed unacceptable risks to the broader rebellion, as any survivors who managed to escape the system could carry word of the betrayal to Terra. The siege warfare that developed around the precentor's palace represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the Istvan III campaign. The traitor forces, accustomed to the rapid, decisive victories that had characterized the Great Crusade, found themselves forced to conduct a methodical assault against well-prepared defensive positions. The palace's fortifications, designed by Imperial engineers who understood the requirements of siege warfare, channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones while providing defenders with multiple fallback positions. The traitors' initial ground assaults focused on the palace's outer defensive perimeter, where automated weapon systems and Loyalist firing positions controlled the approaches to the main structure. These attacks quickly revealed the challenges inherent in assaulting a position held by veteran Astartes who were fighting for their survival. The attacking forces, despite their numerical superiority, found themselves unable to achieve the rapid breakthrough that their tactical doctrine required. Each assault resulted in significant casualties while achieving minimal territorial gains. The Loyalist defenders' tactics reflected their desperate situation and their intimate knowledge of the palace's defensive systems. Rather than attempting to hold static positions against overwhelming odds, they employed a flexible defense that maximized the effectiveness of their limited numbers. Small teams of defenders would engage attacking forces from prepared positions, inflicting casualties before withdrawing to secondary defensive lines. This approach forced the traders to clear each defensive position individually while never allowing them to concentrate their forces for decisive attacks. The battles within the palace complex itself became increasingly intense as the trader forces gradually fought their way through the outer defenses. The building's internal layout, with its maze of corridors, chambers, and defensive positions, created a three-dimensional battlefield where conventional tactical formations proved ineffective. Combat devolved into close-quarters engagements, where individual skill and determination often proved more important than numerical superiority or superior equipment. The defense of the throne room, located in the palace's upper levels, became a focal point of the Loyalist resistance both tactically and symbolically. The massive chamber, with its soaring ceiling and walls decorated with imperial iconography, represented the heart of imperial authority on Istvan III. The room's design, intended for ceremonial functions rather than combat, created unique tactical challenges for both attackers and defenders. The throne room's elevated galleries provided excellent firing positions for Loyalist defenders, while its multiple entrances forced attacking forces to coordinate their movements carefully to avoid being caught in crossfires. The fighting in the throne room demonstrated the tactical adaptability that had made the legions Astartes the Emperor's most effective military instrument. Loyalist defenders used the room's architectural features to create improvised fortifications, while traitor assault teams employed specialized equipment to breach defensive positions. The battle's intensity was heightened by its symbolic significance, as both sides recognized that control of the throne room would represent a powerful propaganda victory for whichever faction ultimately prevailed. The palace's lower levels became the site of some of the most desperate fighting of the entire siege, as the confined spaces and limited visibility created conditions that favored the defenders' intimate knowledge of the terrain. The maintenance tunnels and service corridors that honeycombed the building's foundation provided the Loyalists with concealed movement routes and ambush positions that the attacking forces struggled to counter. These underground battles often involved small groups of warriors fighting with knives and pistols in spaces too confined for conventional weapons. The leadership dynamics among the Loyalist survivors evolved significantly during the siege, as the extreme circumstances forced rapid adaptation of traditional command structures. Loken's overall command of the defense was supplemented by specialized leadership roles that reflected the unique challenges of siege warfare. Torgadon assumed responsibility for coordinating the mobile defense teams that conducted raids against traitor positions, while survivors from other legions contributed their specialized knowledge of different aspects of the defense. The cooperation between former rivals from different legions represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the Loyalist resistance. Warriors who had been trained to view their genetic heritage as the defining aspect of their identity now found themselves fighting alongside battle brothers from legions they had previously regarded with suspicion or contempt. Death Guard survivors worked alongside Emperor's Children veterans to maintain defensive positions, while World Eaters and Luna Wolves coordinated assault teams against traitor strongpoints. This unprecedented cooperation was born of necessity, but created bonds that transcended traditional legion loyalties. The siege's prolonged nature created logistical challenges that tested the survivors' resourcefulness and determination. The palace's stockpiles of ammunition and supplies, while substantial, were not unlimited, and the Loyalists had to carefully manage their resources while maintaining an effective defense. Scavenging teams continued to operate in the ruins surrounding the palace, gathering equipment and supplies from abandoned positions while avoiding detection by traitor patrols. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the Loyalist survivors went far beyond the physical wounds of battle or even the horror of witnessing their homeworld's destruction. For warriors who had spent decades or centuries fighting alongside their Legion brothers, the realization that these same companions had become mortal enemies created a form of spiritual devastation that threatened to shatter their ability to function as effective combatants. The bonds forged through shared warfare, mutual sacrifice, and the brotherhood of the gene seed ran deeper than mere camaraderie. They represented the fundamental structure upon which each Astartes had built his identity and understanding of his place in the galaxy. Captain Garville Loken experienced this psychological rupture most acutely during his first direct confrontation with former Luna Wolves who had embraced Horus's rebellion. The engagement occurred in the industrial sector surrounding the Precentor's palace, where a reconnaissance patrol under Loken's command encountered a squad of Sons of Horus conducting their own intelligence-gathering mission. The moment of recognition between the two groups created a pause that lasted several heartbeats, as warriors who had served together for over 8 decades struggled to process the reality that they were now enemies. The Sons of Horus squad was led by Sergeant Udon Cruz, a veteran whom Loken had personally recommended for promotion following the Ulanner campaign. Cruz had been present at Loken's elevation to the Mournival, had shared countless meals in the company mess halls, and had fought beside Loken in the tunnels beneath Murder's surface. Now the sergeant's armor bore the Eye of Horus in place of the Luna Wolves' crescent moon, while his face showed the subtle signs of corruption that marked those who had fully embraced the Warrior Lodge philosophies. The firefight that erupted between the two patrols lasted only minutes, but its intensity reflected the intimate knowledge each side possessed of their opponent's tactics and capabilities. Loken knew exactly how Cruz would position his men, could predict the sergeant's likely responses to different tactical situations, and understood the specific strengths and weaknesses of each warrior in the enemy squad. This knowledge, which should have provided a decisive advantage, instead created a form of tactical paralysis, as Loken found himself anticipating moves that never came, expecting familiar patterns of behavior from warriors whose fundamental nature had been transformed by corruption. The traitor Astartes displayed tactical innovations that revealed how thoroughly their perspective on warfare had changed since embracing Horus's rebellion. Where once they had fought with the disciplined precision that characterized all Legion operations, they now employed brutal efficiency that prioritized results over honor or adherence to established doctrine. Cruz's squad used human shields taken from civilian refugees, positioned explosive charges in ways that would maximize collateral damage, and employed ammunition types that had been forbidden under Imperial rules of engagement. The psychological impact of fighting former brothers extended beyond individual encounters to affect the entire structure of Loyalist operations. Traditional Astartes tactics relied heavily on predictable behavioral patterns and standardized responses that allowed different units to coordinate their actions without extensive communication. When facing traitor forces drawn from their own legions, these assumptions became liabilities rather than assets. Loyalist commanders found themselves second-guessing tactical decisions that would have been automatic when fighting Xenos or human rebels, uncertain whether their opponents would respond according to familiar patterns or employ completely unexpected approaches. The breakdown of predictable tactical behavior forced rapid adaptation in combat doctrine among the Loyalist survivors. Captain Tarek Torgeddon pioneered many of these adaptations during his raids against traitor positions in the ruins surrounding the palace. Rather than relying on the standard assault patterns taught in Legion training facilities, Torgeddon's teams employed improvised tactics that combined elements from different Legion traditions while incorporating lessons learned from fighting against Astartes' opponents. The specialized ammunition required for effective Astartes versus Astartes combat presented significant logistical challenges for the Loyalist survivors. Standard bolter rounds, while devastating against human targets, proved insufficient against the enhanced physiology and superior armor of Space Marine opponents. The Loyalists were forced to rely on Kraken penetrator rounds, whose depleted uranium cores could punch through power armor at close range, and Hellfire rounds loaded with mutagenic acids that could bypass armor seals and attack the enhanced organs that kept Astartes functional in hostile environments. The scarcity of these specialized munitions forced Loyalist forces to engage traitor units at closer ranges than conventional tactics would dictate, turning many encounters into desperate close-quarters battles where chainswords and combat knives became the primary weapons. The palace's corridors and chambers became killing grounds, where centuries of martial training were distilled into moments of savage violence between warriors who possessed identical capabilities and training. Victory in these encounters often depended on factors as subtle as the maintenance condition of a weapon's machine spirit or the specific psychological state of individual combatants. Boarding actions against traitor positions required fundamental modifications to standard assault doctrines, as the defenders possessed the same tactical knowledge and equipment as the attacking forces. Loyalist assault teams had to abandon the predictable breach and clear patterns that had proven effective against human opponents, instead developing fluid assault techniques that could adapt to the sophisticated defensive measures employed by traitor Astartes. These new tactics emphasized speed and unpredictability over the methodical precision that had traditionally characterized Legion operations. The modification of boarding shields and assault equipment reflected the unique challenges of fighting opponents with identical capabilities. Loyalist tech marines worked to enhance the protective capabilities of riot shields and boarding equipment, adding additional layers of ceramite plating and incorporating energy field generators salvaged from damaged power armor. These modifications increased the weight and power requirements of the equipment significantly, but provided the additional protection necessary to survive the concentrated firepower that traitor defenders could bring to bear. The psychological preparation required for Astartes versus Astartes combat proved as important as the tactical adaptations. Loyalist survivors had to overcome conditioning that made it nearly impossible to kill fellow Space Marines, programming that had been deliberately built into their training to prevent exactly the kind of fratricidal warfare that now consumed Istvan III. The process of overcoming this conditioning required conscious effort and often resulted in lasting psychological damage that affected survivors long after individual battles had ended. The most devastating encounters occurred when Loyalist forces faced traitor units from their own specific companies or squads. These battles carried emotional weight that went beyond mere tactical considerations, as warriors found themselves fighting against battle brothers with whom they had shared the most intimate bonds of brotherhood. The knowledge of each opponent's individual fighting style, personal history, and psychological makeup created a form of combat that was simultaneously more personal and more brutal than any warfare the Astartes had previously experienced. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard experienced this personal dimension of the brothers' war during a boarding action against a traitor stronghold in the palace's eastern wing. The Death Guard survivors under Garrow's command encountered a defensive position held by members of their own 7th Company, warriors who had served under Garrow's direct command for over 6 decades. The captain recognized each traitor defender by name, knew their individual specialties and personal quirks, and had shared countless battles with men who now sought to kill him without hesitation or remorse. The engagement that followed demonstrated how the corruption of the warrior lodges had transformed not just the loyalties, but the fundamental nature of the affected Astartes. The traitor Death Guard employed tactics that would have been unthinkable for members of Mortarian's Legion under normal circumstances, using chemical weapons against their former brothers, and fighting with a reckless disregard for casualties that contradicted everything the Death Guard had traditionally represented. Their movements showed the same methodical precision that characterized all Death Guard operations, but this familiarity was twisted into something alien and threatening. The duel between former brothers in arms reached its most personal expression in the confrontation between loyalist and traitor captains who had once served together in the same command structures. These encounters carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond their immediate tactical significance, representing the fundamental schism that had torn apart the legion's Astartes. The combatants brought to these duels not just their martial skills, but also intimate knowledge of their opponents' fighting styles, psychological weaknesses, and personal motivations. The most significant of these confrontations occurred when Captain Saul Tarvitz encountered Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children 13th Company in the ruins of what had once been the palace's Hall of Victories. Lucius had been Tarvitz's closest friend within the Legion, a warrior whose pursuit of martial perfection had made him one of the finest swordsmen in the Emperor's Children. The two captains had sparred together countless times, had served in the same campaigns, and had shared the bonds of brotherhood that defined their legion's culture. The corruption that had transformed Lucius was immediately apparent in both his appearance and his fighting style. The captain's armor bore modifications that served no tactical purpose, decorative elements that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light of the ruined hall. His movements retained the fluid grace that had always characterized his swordsmanship, but this elegance was now tainted with an alien quality that suggested influences beyond human understanding. The familiar patterns of his blade work had been altered in subtle ways that made them more effective, but also more disturbing to witness. The duel between Tarvitz and Lucius lasted nearly an hour, as both combatants possessed intimate knowledge of their opponent's capabilities and fighting style. Each attack was met with a counter that had been practiced in countless training sessions, while every defensive position was tested by techniques that both warriors had perfected together. The familiarity between the combatants created a form of deadlock that could only be broken when one fighter abandoned the patterns and techniques that his opponent knew so well. The psychological dimension of the duel proved as important as the physical combat, as both captains struggled with the emotional weight of fighting someone who had once been closer than a brother. Tarvitz found himself hesitating at critical moments, his loyalty to old friendships creating openings that Lucius was quick to exploit. The traitor captain showed no such restraint, his corruption having burned away the emotional connections that might have weakened his resolve. This asymmetry in psychological commitment gradually gave Lucius the advantage, as his willingness to employ any tactic necessary contrasted sharply with Tarvitz's adherence to the honor codes that had once governed their shared service. The breakdown of traditional Legion hierarchy became most apparent in the mixed units that formed among the Loyalist survivors. Warriors who had been conditioned to follow the commands of their genetic fathers without question now found themselves serving under officers from different legions, taking orders from captains whose authority derived from tactical competence rather than hereditary right. This fundamental shift in command structure required conscious effort from both leaders and followers, as centuries of conditioning had to be overcome through deliberate choice. The integration of Death Guard survivors into Loyalist command structures presented particular challenges, as Mortarian's sons had been trained to operate with a degree of independence that sometimes conflicted with the more hierarchical traditions of other legions. Captain Garo's experience commanding mixed units required him to adapt his leadership style to accommodate warriors whose tactical traditions emphasized different approaches to warfare. The Death Guard preference for attrition tactics and methodical advance had to be balanced against the more aggressive approaches favored by Luna Wolves and Emperor's Children survivors. The formation of new squad-level units from survivors of different legions created unprecedented tactical combinations that often proved more effective than traditional single legion formations. A typical mixed squad might include Death Guard specialists in toxic warfare, Emperor's Children experts in precision shooting, and Luna Wolves veterans with experience in assault operations. These combinations created tactical capabilities that no single legion could match, but they also required extensive coordination and training to function effectively. The command protocols developed by the Loyalist survivors reflected their desperate circumstances and the need to maximize the effectiveness of their limited numbers. Traditional legion rank structures were modified to emphasize tactical competence and demonstrated loyalty over formal position within pre-betrayal hierarchies. Warriors who had held junior positions in their original legions found themselves elevated to leadership roles based on their performance during the crisis, while some former officers were relegated to subordinate positions when their capabilities proved inadequate to the new circumstances. The psychological impact of these command structure changes extended beyond mere tactical considerations to affect the fundamental identity of the surviving Astartes. Warriors who had defined themselves primarily through their legion affiliation now had to develop new forms of identity based on their commitment to the imperial cause rather than their genetic heritage. This transformation was particularly difficult for veterans who had served for centuries under the same command structures, as they had to abandon not just familiar procedures, but also the psychological frameworks that had given meaning to their existence. The breakdown of legion-specific tactical doctrines forced the development of hybrid approaches that combine the best elements of different military traditions. The Loyalist survivors experimented with tactical formations that would have been impossible within the rigid structures of individual legions, creating new approaches to warfare that reflected their unique circumstances. These innovations often proved more effective than traditional methods when fighting against traitor forces who expected their opponents to follow familiar patterns. The erosion of traditional authority structures also affected the relationship between Astartes and their supporting mortal personnel. Imperial army units and ship crews who had survived the initial betrayal found themselves working directly with Space Marines in ways that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The desperate need for every available resource forced the abandonment of the strict hierarchical separation that had traditionally governed these relationships, creating new forms of cooperation that maximized the effectiveness of all available forces. The psychological warfare employed by both sides reflected their intimate knowledge of each other's weaknesses and motivations. Traitor forces used Vox broadcasts to demoralize Loyalist survivors, playing recordings of their former brothers denouncing the Emperor and describing the futility of continued resistance. These psychological attacks often proved more devastating than physical assaults, as they struck at the emotional foundations that sustained Loyalist morale during the darkest moments of the siege. The Loyalist response to these psychological attacks required the development of new forms of mental discipline that went beyond traditional Astartes conditioning. The survivors had to learn to compartmentalize their emotional responses to former brothers while maintaining the psychological connections that made coordinated action possible. This balance proved extremely difficult to achieve and maintain, particularly during the prolonged stress of siege warfare, where psychological pressure accumulated over time. The transformation of the Istvan III campaign from a simple compliance action into a fratricidal nightmare had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Legion's Astartes system that had never been anticipated by their creators. The possibility that entire legions might turn against the Emperor had not been seriously considered during the design of Astartes conditioning and training programs, leaving the Loyalist survivors to develop their own solutions to unprecedented challenges. The lessons learned in the ruins of Coral City would eventually influence the reorganization of Imperial military forces, but for the immediate survivors, these innovations represented the difference between victory and extinction in humanity's first civil war. The transformation of three Primarchs from loyal sons of the Emperor into architects of humanity's greatest betrayal represented different paths to damnation, each reflecting the unique character flaws and circumstances that made them vulnerable to chaos corruption. While Horus had fallen through manipulation and wounded pride, Mortarion, Fulgrim, and Angron each brought their own particular darkness to the conspiracy that would culminate in the massacre on Istvan III's burning surface. Mortarion of the Death Guard had always harbored a deep-seated hatred of tyrants that stemmed from his traumatic youth on the poison world of Barbaros. The Primarch's formative years had been spent in constant struggle against the necromantic overlords who ruled his homeworld from their fortress keeps, breathing toxic air that would have killed any normal human while building the physical and mental resilience that would define his character. When the Emperor arrived to claim his lost son, the intervention that denied Mortarion the personal satisfaction of destroying his adoptive father planted seeds of resentment that would fester for decades. The Death Guard Primarch's recruitment to Horus's cause required a different approach than the emotional manipulation that had proven effective with other fallen brothers. Mortarion's analytical mind and natural suspicion made him resistant to simple appeals to ambition or glory. Instead, Horus focused on the Lord of Death's philosophical objections to the imperial system, particularly his belief that the Emperor represented merely another form of the tyranny he had spent his youth fighting against. The War Master presented compelling arguments about the Master of Mankind's true nature, suggesting that the Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade to pursue mysterious projects on Terra revealed his intention to abandon his sons once their usefulness had ended. The corruption of Mortarion accelerated following his exposure to the warrior lodge networks that had spread throughout the Death Guard. The Primarch's natural affinity for endurance and his legion's cultural emphasis on bearing any burden for the greater good made them particularly susceptible to the lodge philosophy of enlightened suffering. Lodge meetings became venues for discussing the sacrifices that the Death Guard had made in the Emperor's name, cataloging the casualties suffered in toxic environments and hazardous deployments, while their Gene Father pursued projects that seemed to benefit only himself. The Death Guard's tactical doctrine made them invaluable assets for the Istvan III operation, as their expertise in chemical warfare and toxic environments positioned them perfectly to exploit the aftermath of the virus bombing. Mortarion's warriors had spent decades fighting in conditions that would have killed Astartes from other legions, developing specialized equipment and techniques that allowed them to operate effectively in the poisoned atmosphere that lingered after the Life Eater virus had done its work. Their Mk3 iron armor, with its enhanced environmental seals and integrated rebreather systems, provided superior protection against the toxic gases that continued to seep from the planet's contaminated surface. The Death Guard contingent assigned to Istvan III included some of the Legion's most experienced veterans, warriors who had proven their loyalty to Mortarion through decades of service in the galaxy's most hazardous war zones. Captain Kala's Typhon commanded the largest Death Guard formation on the planet's surface, leading elements of the first company that had been specifically selected for their proven reliability and combat effectiveness. These warriors represented the cream of the 14th Legion, men whose dedication to their Primarch was absolute and whose tactical capabilities had been honed through countless campaigns against Xeno's threats and human rebels. The Death Guard's approach to the massacre differed significantly from the methods employed by the other traitor legions, reflecting their cultural emphasis on methodical warfare and overwhelming firepower. Rather than seeking quick, decisive engagements, Mortarion's sons implemented a systematic campaign of attrition designed to wear down the loyalist survivors through constant pressure and the gradual degradation of their defensive capabilities. They established fortified positions in the ruins surrounding the precentor's palace, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement across the devastated cityscape extremely hazardous for loyalist forces. The specialized equipment deployed by the Death Guard included heavy flamers loaded with promethium-based compounds that could maintain combustion even in the toxic atmosphere, meltaguns whose focused heat beams proved effective against the improvised fortifications constructed by loyalist survivors, and missile launchers firing toxin-tipped warheads that could penetrate sealed environments and poison the air supplies that kept the defenders alive. These weapons reflected the Death Guard's pragmatic approach to warfare, prioritizing effectiveness over honor or adherence to traditional combat doctrines. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children represented a fundamentally different form of corruption, one that had begun with the seemingly innocent acquisition of an alien weapon during the Legion's campaign against the Lair. The sword, discovered in the ruins of the Xeno civilization that the Emperor's Children had recently destroyed, appeared to be nothing more than an exquisite example of alien craftsmanship. Its blade was forged from materials that seemed to shift between different metallic hues depending on the viewing angle, while its grip was wrapped in what appeared to be some form of synthetic leather that molded itself perfectly to the wielder's hand. The demon bound within the lair blade worked its corruption through subtle influence rather than direct possession, whispering suggestions that seemed to emerge from Fulgrim's own thoughts rather than external sources. The entity encouraged the Primarch's natural perfectionism, suggesting that true excellence could only be achieved by transcending the limitations imposed by imperial doctrine and moral constraints. These whispers found fertile ground in Fulgrim's growing frustration with what he perceived as the mediocrity that surrounded him, particularly among his brother Primarchs, who seemed content with adequate performance rather than pursuing true perfection. The Emperor's children's transformation under Fulgrim's corrupted leadership manifested in increasingly extreme interpretations of their legion's pursuit of excellence. Warriors who had once sought perfection in martial disciplines and tactical execution began exploring more esoteric forms of achievement, experimenting with combat drugs that enhanced their reflexes and pain tolerance while pursuing sensory experiences that pushed the boundaries of human perception. The Legion's apothecaries developed new chemical compounds that could heighten awareness and extend endurance, allowing their warriors to fight for extended periods without fatigue while experiencing combat with unprecedented intensity. The corruption of the Emperor's children was particularly insidious because it built upon the Legion's existing culture and values rather than requiring a fundamental transformation of their identity. The pursuit of perfection that had always defined the Third Legion simply expanded to encompass areas that had previously been considered forbidden or inappropriate. Warriors began to view traditional moral constraints as obstacles to true achievement, while their definition of excellence evolved to include capabilities and experiences that transcended normal human limitations. The Emperor's Children forces deployed to Istvan III included many of the Legion's most accomplished warriors, veterans whose pursuit of martial perfection had made them among the finest fighters in the Legion's Astartes. Captain Lucius commanded elements of the 13th Company, bringing with him warriors whose swordsmanship and close combat expertise had been refined through decades of constant training and combat experience. These Astartes approached the massacre not as a necessary evil, but as an opportunity to test their skills against opponents who possessed identical training and capabilities. The tactical innovations employed by the Emperor's children reflected their obsession with achieving perfect execution of military operations. They developed new assault techniques that emphasized precision and elegance over brute force, creating coordinated attacks that resembled deadly choreography more than conventional warfare. Their weapons were modified to achieve levels of accuracy and effectiveness that bordered on the artistic, with each shot and blade stroke calculated to achieve maximum impact with minimal effort. The Emperor's Children's approach to the Loyalist survivors combined tactical brilliance with calculated cruelty, as they sought to demonstrate their superiority through the methodical destruction of their former brothers. They employed psychological warfare techniques designed to break the morale of Loyalist defenders, broadcasting recordings of tortured prisoners, and displaying the mutilated corpses of captured Loyalists in positions visible from the palace's defensive positions. These tactics reflected the Legion's evolution from noble warriors into something far more sinister, as their pursuit of perfection had led them to explore the perfect application of fear and despair as weapons of war. Angron of the World Eaters brought a different form of darkness to the Istvan III conspiracy, one rooted in pain, rage, and the mechanical augmentations that had been forced upon him during his youth as a gladiator on New Syria. The butcher's nails implanted in his skull had gradually eroded his capacity for complex thought and emotional connection, leaving him capable of little beyond fury and violence. However, this apparent simplicity masked a deeper tragedy, as Angron's rage was fueled by the constant awareness of what he had lost when the Emperor denied him the honorable death he had chosen alongside his fellow slaves. The Red Angel's participation in Horus's rebellion was motivated less by complex political calculations than by his desire to strike back at the imperial system that had denied him the only thing he had ever truly wanted: the right to die on his own terms alongside the brothers and sisters who had shared his bondage. The Emperor's intervention on New Syria had saved Angron's physical existence while destroying everything that gave his life meaning, creating a wound that no amount of conquest or glory could heal. The World Eater's tactical doctrine under Angron's leadership had evolved to emphasize close-quarters combat and overwhelming aggression, reflecting their Primarch's own preferences and the influence of the Butcher's Nails technology that many of the Legion's warriors had chosen to have implanted in their own skulls. The 12th Legion's approach to warfare prioritized speed and brutality over careful planning or tactical sophistication, seeking to close with the enemy as quickly as possible and destroy them through superior ferocity and combat skill. The World Eater's contingent on Istvan III included some of the Legion's most experienced assault specialists, warriors whose implants had been carefully calibrated to provide maximum combat effectiveness without completely destroying their capacity for tactical thinking. Captain Karn commanded the largest World Eaters formation on the planet, leading elements of the 8th Assault Company that had proven their effectiveness in countless boarding actions and urban warfare scenarios. These warriors viewed the massacre as an opportunity to unleash their full potential without the restraints typically imposed by Imperial rules of engagement. The modifications made to World Eaters' equipment reflected their emphasis on close-quarters combat and maximum lethality. Their chainswords were fitted with enhanced cutting teeth forged from adamantium alloys, while their bolt pistols were loaded with mass reactive shells designed to cause maximum tissue damage upon impact. Many warriors carried specialized assault weapons, including power axes and chain glaives that could cleave through power armor with devastating effectiveness. The coordination between the 3 traitor Primarchs during the final assault on the Loyalist survivors demonstrated how their different approaches to warfare could be combined into a devastating combined arms operation. Mortarian's Death Guard established the siege lines and maintained constant pressure on the Loyalist positions, their methodical approach wearing down the defenders' capabilities while preventing any possibility of escape or reinforcement. The Death Guard's expertise in toxic warfare proved particularly valuable in exploiting weaknesses in the palace's environmental systems, as they introduced chemical agents that gradually degraded the effectiveness of air filtration systems and contaminated water supplies. Fulgrim's Emperor's Children provided the precision strikes and tactical innovations that identified and exploited specific vulnerabilities in the Loyalist defenses. Their pursuit of perfect execution made them ideal for conducting complex multi-phase operations that required careful timing and coordination between different assault elements. The Emperor's Children's psychological warfare capabilities also proved crucial in breaking down Loyalist morale, as their calculated cruelty created an atmosphere of despair that sapped the defenders' will to resist. Angron's World Eaters served as the primary assault force for the most dangerous breakthrough operations, their berserker fury making them capable of sustaining the casualties necessary to penetrate heavily defended positions. The World Eaters' willingness to accept massive losses in exchange for tactical gains provided the traitor forces with options that more cautious commanders would never have considered, allowing them to achieve objectives through sheer determination and disregard for their own survival. The 3 legions' different specializations created tactical synergies that maximized the effectiveness of the combined traitor force. Death Guard siege specialists would identify structural weaknesses in Loyalist fortifications. Emperor's Children precision teams would exploit these vulnerabilities with carefully planned strikes, and World Eaters' assault troops would pour through the resulting breaches to engage the defenders in close combat, where their berserker training provided decisive advantages. The final phase of the assault saw all 3 traitor legions working in unprecedented coordination to eliminate the last pockets of Loyalist resistance. The methodical nature of this operation reflected the careful planning that had gone into the entire Istvan III campaign, as the traitor commanders sought to ensure that no loyalist survivors could escape to carry word of the betrayal to Terra. The combination of Death Guard siege warfare, Emperor's Children precision tactics, and World Eater's assault capabilities created a military force that could overcome any defensive position through the systematic application of overwhelming firepower and tactical expertise. The systematic destruction of the Loyalist resistance entered its final phase as ammunition stockpiles dwindled to critical levels, and the defensive positions that had held for weeks began to crumble under the relentless pressure of overwhelming traitor numbers. The Precentor's palace, once an imposing symbol of imperial authority rising majestically above Coral City's skyline, now stood as a battered monument to defiance, its ceramite walls scarred by countless impacts, and its defensive towers reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal and shattered rockcrete. Captain Garville Loken moved through the palace's lower levels with the measured pace of a warrior who understood that each step might be his last. The Luna Wolves veteran's power armor bore the accumulated damage of weeks of continuous combat. Its blue-gray ceramite plates cracked and scorched, while the wolf's head insignia on his shoulder guard had been partially obliterated by a plasma blast that had come within centimeters of ending his life. The captain's bolt pistol hung heavy at his side, its ammunition counter displaying the harsh reality that faced all the defenders. Fewer than 30 rounds remained in his personal supply, with no prospect of resupply from the palace's depleted armories. The Loyalist survivors had been forced to implement increasingly desperate measures to conserve their dwindling ammunition supplies. Standard bolter rounds were reserved for confirmed kills against high-value targets, while the precious Kraken penetrator rounds that could punch through traitor power armor were rationed with the care typically reserved for sacred relics. Many defenders had been reduced to fighting with salvaged weapons stripped from fallen enemies, creating a bizarre situation where Loyalist Astartes wielded the same equipment as their traitorous brothers while being unable to trust the machine spirits that governed these weapons' operation. The palace's eastern wing had fallen during the previous night's assault, its defenders overwhelmed when a concentrated World Eater's breakthrough punched through 3 separate defensive lines in less than an hour. The berserker fury of Angron's sons had proven unstoppable once they gained momentum, their chain axes carving through Loyalist positions with mechanical precision, while their enhanced aggression drove them forward despite casualties that would have broken any normal military formation. The loss of the Eastern Wing had cost the Loyalists nearly 200 defenders, including several veteran sergeants whose tactical expertise could not be replaced. Captain Saul Tarvitz coordinated the defense of the palace's central courtyard from a command post established in what had once been the building's primary communications center. The Emperor's Children veteran had aged visibly during the siege, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by the haggard look of a warrior who had been pushed beyond the limits of even superhuman endurance. His armor's purple and gold livery was now almost completely obscured by soot and battle damage, while his face bore the distinctive pallor that came from weeks of fighting in the toxic atmosphere that still lingered over Istvan III's surface. The tactical situation reports that Reach Tarvitz painted a picture of systematic collapse across all defensive sectors. The northern approaches to the palace were under constant bombardment from Death Guard heavy weapons teams that had established firing positions in the ruins of the commercial district, their methodical approach gradually reducing the Loyalist fortifications to rubble through sustained application of missile strikes and heavy bolter fire. The southern perimeter had been breached in 3 separate locations, forcing the defenders to fall back to secondary positions that lacked the prepared defenses of the original lines. The western wing of the palace had become a charnel house where Emperor's Children assault teams conducted what could only be described as artistic displays of violence against the Loyalist defenders. The traitor warriors had abandoned any pretense of tactical efficiency in favor of elaborate executions that seemed designed more to demonstrate their superiority than to achieve military objectives. Loyalist prisoners were tortured in full view of their comrades, their screams echoing through the palace corridors as a form of psychological warfare that proved devastatingly effective against defenders already pushed to the breaking point. Captain Tarek Torgadin led the final evacuation of the palace's upper levels, guiding the last mobile defenders toward the reinforced positions in the building's foundation levels. The former Mournival member's characteristic humor had been burned away by weeks of witnessing the systematic destruction of everything he had once held sacred, replaced by a grim determination that reflected the reality of their situation. His bolt pistol had been empty for 3 days, forcing him to rely on a salvaged chainsword whose machine spirit had been damaged by repeated impacts against traitor armor. The descent through the palace's central stairwell became a fighting withdrawal as traitor forces pressed their advantage, pouring through the breaches in the upper levels to pursue the retreating loyalists. The confined space of the stairwell created a tactical nightmare where the defenders' superior knowledge of the terrain provided their only advantage against numerically superior opponents. Torgadin's rearguard action involved the systematic destruction of structural supports and the activation of automated defense systems that had been held in reserve for exactly this situation. The palace's lower levels had been transformed into a labyrinth of improvised fortifications and defensive positions that reflected the engineering expertise of the surviving tech marines. Corridor intersections had been blocked with welded bulkheads that channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones, while the building's original architectural features had been modified to create overlapping fields of fire that maximized the effectiveness of the defenders' limited ammunition supplies. These modifications represented the accumulated tactical knowledge of veteran Astartes who understood that their survival depended on making every shot count. The command structure among the Loyalist survivors had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to traditional Legion organization, as the desperate circumstances had forced the abandonment of formal hierarchies in favor of practical leadership based on tactical competence and demonstrated effectiveness. Loken retained overall command of the defense, but his authority was supplemented by specialized commanders who had emerged during the siege based on their ability to achieve results under impossible conditions. Sergeant Eacton Cruz of the Luna Wolves had become the de facto leader of the palace's internal security, his age and experience making him invaluable for coordinating the complex defensive measures that kept the Loyalists alive. The veteran's knowledge of siege warfare, gained through decades of compliance actions against fortified positions, had proven crucial in adapting Imperial assault doctrines for defensive use. His weathered features bore the distinctive scars of a warrior who had survived more battles than most Astartes would see in several lifetimes, while his calm demeanor provided a stabilizing influence on younger warriors who were experiencing their first taste of truly desperate combat. The medical situation among the Loyalist survivors had deteriorated to the point where even the enhanced healing capabilities of Astartes' physiology could not compensate for the accumulated damage of weeks of continuous fighting. The palace's medical facilities had been destroyed during the early phases of the siege, forcing the defenders to rely on battlefield medicine administered by warriors with limited training in advanced surgical procedures. Many of the surviving Astartes bore wounds that would have required extensive treatment under normal circumstances, injuries that had been hastily sealed with combat stims and prayer while the fighting continued around them. Apothecary Fabius of the Emperor's Children had remained with the Loyalist survivors despite opportunities to evacuate with other medical personnel, his dedication to his oath of service overriding the practical considerations that had led many support staff to abandon their posts. The veteran medic worked tirelessly to keep the wounded defenders functional, using techniques that pushed the boundaries of established medical doctrine while improvising treatments from whatever supplies could be scavenged from the palace's ruins. His surgical expertise had saved dozens of lives that would otherwise have been lost to wounds that overwhelmed even Astartes' healing capabilities. The psychological impact of prolonged siege warfare had begun to manifest in ways that went beyond simple battle fatigue, as the Loyalist survivors struggled with the reality that their situation was fundamentally hopeless. The knowledge that no relief was coming, that their deaths would serve no strategic purpose beyond denying the traitors an easy victory, created a form of existential despair that threatened to break even the iron discipline of veteran space marines. Some defenders had begun to exhibit signs of combat stress that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, their superhuman conditioning finally beginning to crack under pressures that exceeded anything their creators had anticipated. The final assault began with a coordinated bombardment that lasted for 6 hours, as the traitor forces sought to eliminate the last pockets of organized resistance through the systematic application of overwhelming firepower. Death Guard missile teams fired salvos of toxin-tipped warheads that penetrated the palace's environmental systems and poisoned the air supplies that kept the defenders alive. Emperor's Children precision teams used melta charges to breach the reinforced bulkheads that protected the Loyalist command centers, while World Eater's assault squads prepared for the close-quarters fighting that would determine the siege's final outcome. The bombardment's intensity exceeded anything the Loyalists had previously experienced, as the traitor commanders committed their remaining heavy weapons and ammunition reserves to ensure that no defender could survive the final assault. The palace's structure groaned under the impact of hundreds of explosive shells, while the building's power systems began to fail as critical components were destroyed by the sustained bombardment. Emergency lighting flickered and died throughout the complex, leaving the defenders to fight in near darkness while toxic gases seeped through damaged environmental seals. Captain Loken's final stand took place in the palace's central command chamber, where he led a mixed force of Luna Wolves and Death Guard survivors against a World Eater's assault team that had broken through the outer defenses. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but its intensity reflected the accumulated fury of weeks of fratricidal warfare. Loken's combat expertise, honed through decades of warfare against Xenos threats and human rebels, proved insufficient against opponents who possessed identical training and superior numbers. The Luna Wolves' captain's death came not from a single decisive blow, but from the accumulated damage of multiple wounds that overwhelmed even his enhanced physiology. A chainsword thrust that penetrated his abdominal armor was followed by a bolt pistol shot that shattered his left shoulder, while a power axe strike that he partially deflected still managed to crack his helmet and damage the neural interfaces that connected his armor to his nervous system. Loken continued fighting for several minutes after receiving wounds that would have killed a normal human instantly, his determination to protect his remaining men driving him forward even as his body began to shut down. The captain's final moments were witnessed by Sergeant Cruz, who watched from a concealed position as his former commander fell beneath the combined assault of 3 World Eater's warriors. Loken's death was neither quick nor merciful, as the berserker implants that drove his killers made them incapable of granting a clean end to a fallen enemy. The veteran sergeant's decision to remain hidden rather than attempt a rescue reflected the harsh tactical realities that governed the siege's final hours, as every surviving loyalist understood that their deaths would serve no purpose beyond satisfying their enemy's bloodlust. Captain Tarvitz's heroic last stand occurred in the palace's ceremonial throne room, where he had positioned himself to cover the evacuation of the last mobile defenders. The Emperor's Children veteran faced a full squad of his former brothers, warriors whose corruption had transformed them into something that bore little resemblance to the noble ideals they had once shared. The engagement became a deadly dance of blade and bolt, as Tarvitz's superior swordsmanship was gradually overwhelmed by the numerical superiority and enhanced capabilities of his opponents. The traitor Emperor's Children had been modified with combat stims and neural enhancers that pushed their reflexes and pain tolerance beyond normal Astartes limits, giving them advantages that pure skill could not overcome. Their weapons had been upgraded with exotic ammunition and enhanced power sources that made them devastatingly effective against even the most sophisticated armor. Tarvitz's death came when a power sword thrust penetrated his chest armor and severed the primary aorta that supplied blood to his enhanced organs, causing rapid system failure that even his superhuman constitution could not survive. The systematic execution of wounded loyalists began immediately after organized resistance collapsed, as the traitor forces implemented orders to ensure that no survivor could escape to carry word of the betrayal to Terra. World Eater's assault teams moved through the palace's lower levels with methodical precision, using their enhanced senses to locate loyalists who had taken refuge in concealed positions or sealed chambers. The berserker fury that characterized their combat behavior was replaced by cold efficiency as they carried out what amounted to an extermination operation. The traitor apothecaries who accompanied the assault teams showed particular interest in loyalist gene seed, the precious biological material that represented the genetic legacy of the Emperor's original design for the Space Marines. Rather than allowing this valuable resource to be recovered by Imperial forces, the traitor medics extracted the gene seed organs from fallen loyalists and subjected them to corruption rituals that would render them useless for creating new Astartes. The desecration of gene seed represented a form of spiritual warfare that went beyond mere tactical considerations, as it ensured that even in death, the loyalist warriors could not contribute to the Emperor's cause. The recovery operations conducted by traitor apothecaries revealed the extent to which chaos corruption had influenced their understanding of their medical duties. Where once they had been dedicated to preserving life and maintaining the genetic purity of their legions, these fallen medics now viewed their role as facilitating the spread of corruption and ensuring that no aspect of Imperial military capability could be salvaged from the massacre. Their surgical techniques had been modified to incorporate ritualistic elements that served no medical purpose but satisfied the demands of the dark powers they now served. The final hours of the siege witnessed acts of heroism that would have been remembered throughout the Imperium if any witnesses had survived to carry word of them to Terra. Individual loyalists fought desperate rearguard actions to buy time for their wounded comrades, while others sacrificed themselves to deny critical intelligence to the traitor forces. These acts of courage reflected the fundamental character of the Astartes, as even in the face of certain death and the knowledge that their sacrifice would serve no strategic purpose, they continued to embody the ideals that had made them the Emperor's chosen warriors. The palace's final collapse came not from enemy action, but from the structural damage accumulated during weeks of bombardment and fighting. The building's foundations, weakened by the repeated impacts of heavy weapons and the destruction of critical support systems, finally gave way under the weight of the superstructure. The collapse buried the last few loyalist survivors, along with many of the traitor forces who had been conducting clearing operations in the lower levels, creating a tomb that would preserve the evidence of humanity's first civil war for any future archaeologists who might investigate the ruins. The aftermath of the massacre revealed the true scope of the betrayal that had consumed the legions sent to Istvan III. Thousands of loyalist Astartes had been eliminated not in glorious battle against the enemies of mankind, but in a fratricidal slaughter orchestrated by the very leaders they had sworn to follow. The virus bombing had claimed the majority of the victims, but the siege that followed had demonstrated the depths of corruption that had taken root in the hearts of the traitor primarchs and their followers. The traitor forces' systematic destruction of all evidence that might reveal the true nature of the Istvan III operation reflected their understanding that the rebellion's success depended on maintaining the element of surprise. Communication arrays were destroyed to prevent any distress signals from reaching Terra, while the few Imperial Navy vessels that had remained loyal were hunted down and destroyed by the traitor fleets. The complete elimination of witnesses ensured that Horus's rebellion could continue to spread throughout the galaxy, while the Emperor remained unaware of the true scope of the threat that was developing. The desecration of loyalist remains continued for days after the fighting had ended, as traitor forces worked to ensure that no trace of Imperial resistance could be recovered from the planet's surface. Bodies were burned in massive pyres that sent columns of toxic smoke into Istvan III's already poisoned atmosphere, while equipment and weapons were either destroyed or corrupted beyond any possibility of future use. The thoroughness of this destruction reflected the traitors' understanding that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and that their survival now depended on the complete success of their rebellion against the Emperor's rule. The silence that descended upon Istvan III following the massacre was not the peaceful quiet of victory, but the hollow emptiness of a world that had been murdered. The planet's surface, once home to millions of Imperial citizens and thousands of loyalist Astartes, now radiated heat signatures that could be detected from the outer system, as cooling magma flows traced geometric patterns across continents that had been reduced to glass and ash. The atmospheric composition readings transmitted by orbital sensor arrays painted a picture of ecological devastation so complete that even the hardy microorganisms that typically survived planetary bombardments had been eradicated by the life-eater virus and subsequent firestorm. The traitor fleets maintained their positions in high orbit, their commanders conducting methodical sweeps of the system to ensure that no Imperial vessels had escaped to carry word of the betrayal to Terra. The thoroughness of these operations reflected Horus's understanding that the rebellion's success depended entirely on maintaining the element of surprise until his forces could position themselves for the next phase of their campaign. Every merchant vessel, every courier ship, every automated beacon that might have recorded evidence of the massacre was systematically hunted down and destroyed by prowling squadrons of traitor interceptors. The strategic implications of the Istvan III atrocity extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory achieved by the traitor forces. The successful elimination of loyalist elements from 4 entire legions had fundamentally altered the balance of power within the legion's Astartes, removing tens of thousands of veteran warriors whose experience and dedication to the Imperial cause would have proven invaluable in the coming civil war. The massacre had also demonstrated the effectiveness of the virus bombing as a weapon of mass destruction, establishing a precedent for the use of forbidden weapons that would characterize the increasingly desperate nature of the conflict. The Death Guard's post-battle operations on Istvan III's surface revealed the extent to which Mortarian's legion had adapted to warfare in toxic environments. Specialized teams equipped with enhanced environmental suits conducted systematic searches of the planet's ruins, seeking any evidence that loyalist survivors might have escaped the initial bombardment. The methodical nature of these operations reflected the Death Guard's tactical doctrine, as they established grid patterns that ensured complete coverage of the devastated landscape while maintaining constant communication with orbital command centers. The toxic atmosphere that lingered over Istvan III created conditions that would have been lethal to unprotected humans for decades, but the Death Guard's expertise in chemical warfare allowed them to operate effectively in environments that exceeded the safety parameters of standard power armor. Their modified Mark III iron armor incorporated additional filtration systems and enhanced environmental seals that provided protection against the exotic toxins released by the life-eater virus, while their weapons had been adapted to function reliably despite the corrosive effects of the planet's contaminated atmosphere. The Emperor's Children contingent that remained on Istvan III after the massacre conducted what could only be described as artistic documentation of their victory, creating elaborate displays from the remains of loyalist defenders that served no tactical purpose but satisfied their corrupted aesthetic sensibilities. These grotesque monuments to perfection reflected the fundamental changes that had occurred within Fulgrim's Legion, as their pursuit of excellence had evolved into something that bore no resemblance to the noble ideals they had once embodied. The precision with which these displays were constructed demonstrated the technical expertise that the Emperor's Children retained even as their moral compass had been completely corrupted. The World Eater's behavior in the aftermath of the massacre revealed the extent to which the Butcher's nails had eroded their capacity for anything beyond violence and destruction. Angron's sons continued to seek out combat even after organized resistance had ended, turning their aggression against the planet's infrastructure and each other when no enemies remained to fight. The Berserker implants that drove their behavior made it impossible for them to find satisfaction in victory, as their neural modifications required constant stimulation through violence and bloodshed. The coordination required to maintain operational security across 4 separate legions, while conducting the systematic destruction of evidence, demonstrated the sophistication of the conspiracy that Erebus and his fellow word-bearers had orchestrated. Communication protocols established through the Warrior Lodge networks allowed traitor commanders to coordinate their activities without relying on official channels that might have been monitored by loyalist intelligence services. The Lodge system's emphasis on personal relationships and informal hierarchies proved ideally suited to managing the complex logistics of a galaxy-spanning rebellion. The astropathic silence that emanated from the Istvan system created the first indication that something catastrophic had occurred, though the true nature of the disaster would not become apparent for several more weeks. The complete cessation of communications from a system that had previously maintained regular contact with Terra and other Imperial worlds represented an anomaly that could not be explained by routine technical difficulties or local conflicts. The absence of scheduled supply convoys and administrative reports gradually accumulated into a pattern that suggested systematic destruction rather than isolated incidents. The Imperial bureaucracy's response to the communication blackout from Istvan reflected the administrative inefficiencies that plagued the expanding Imperium during the Great Crusade's final years. The vast scale of military operations across thousands of worlds meant that communication disruptions were common enough that individual incidents rarely triggered immediate investigation. Standard protocols called for patience and the assumption that local commanders would resolve whatever problems had caused the silence, an approach that served the traitors' interests by delaying any organized response to their actions. The few Imperial vessels that had been operating in adjacent systems when the massacre occurred provided fragmentary evidence that something unprecedented had happened in the Istvan system. Long-range sensor readings detected massive energy signatures consistent with orbital bombardment, while communication intercepts revealed coded transmissions between traitor fleets that suggested coordinated military operations. However, the incomplete nature of this intelligence made it impossible for Imperial analysts to determine the true scope of what had occurred without direct investigation. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard had been aboard the frigate Eisenstein when the virus bombing began, serving as part of the fleet security detail that maintained order among the diverse collection of vessels that comprised the Istvan Expeditionary Force. The veteran officer's position provided him with access to communication networks and operational intelligence that revealed the true nature of Horus's plans, knowledge that would prove crucial to the Imperium's survival in the coming years. Garrow's loyalty to the Emperor had never wavered despite the corruption that had consumed his legion, and his recognition of the betrayal's implications drove him to take desperate action. The Eisenstein's escape from the Istvan system required careful planning and exceptional skill, as the frigate had to evade detection by traitor fleets while navigating the complex gravitational fields that surrounded the system's primary star. Garrow's command of the vessel was complicated by the fact that many of its crew members had been corrupted by the same influences that had turned their legion against the Emperor, creating a situation where the captain could not trust his own subordinates. The identification of loyalist crew members and the neutralization of potential threats became a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the confined spaces of a starship under constant threat of discovery. The frigate's journey to Terra was marked by a series of increasingly desperate encounters with traitor forces that had been positioned to intercept any vessels attempting to escape the Istvan system. The Eisenstein's relatively small size and limited armament made it unsuitable for direct confrontation with the heavy cruisers and battleships that patrolled the system's outer reaches, forcing Garrow to rely on stealth and misdirection to avoid detection. The captain's intimate knowledge of Death Guard tactical doctrine proved invaluable in predicting the behavior of pursuing vessels and identifying opportunities to break contact with superior forces. The technical challenges involved in maintaining the Eisenstein's operational capabilities during the extended journey to Terra pushed the vessel systems beyond their design parameters. The frigate's plasma reactors, designed for short-range operations in support of larger fleet formations, struggled to provide sufficient power for the extended warp jumps required to reach the Sol system. The ship's Geller field generators, crucial for protection during warp transit, showed signs of degradation that threatened to expose the vessel and its crew to the predations of warp entities that were drawn to the psychic emanations of desperate souls. The Eisenstein's arrival in the Sol system created a crisis within the Imperial military hierarchy, as Garo's reports of the Istvan III massacre contradicted official communications that had portrayed the operation as a routine compliance action. The captain's detailed accounts of the virus bombing and the systematic elimination of loyalist forces provided the first concrete evidence that Horus's rebellion had progressed far beyond mere political dissent into open warfare against the Emperor's rule. The implications of this intelligence forced a fundamental reassessment of the strategic situation throughout the galaxy. The verification of Garo's reports required extensive investigation by Imperial intelligence services, as the magnitude of the betrayal seemed almost impossible to believe. The systematic corruption of 4 entire legions, the deployment of forbidden weapons against Imperial forces, and the orchestration of a galaxy-spanning conspiracy challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Imperial military doctrine had been based. The possibility that the War Master himself had turned traitor represented a scenario that had never been seriously considered by Imperial strategic planners. The psychological impact of the Istvan III revelations on the Imperial High Command was profound, as senior officers struggled to process the reality that their most trusted allies had become their deadliest enemies. The warrior lodge networks that had spread throughout the legions were suddenly revealed as vectors for corruption rather than harmless fraternal organizations, while the tactical doctrines that had proven effective against Xeno's threats were recognized as potentially inadequate for fighting against opponents with identical training and equipment. The strategic redeployment of Imperial forces in response to the Istvan intelligence required careful consideration of loyalty and reliability factors that had never previously been relevant to military planning. Entire legion formations that had been considered absolutely trustworthy were suddenly viewed with suspicion, while the identification of potentially corrupted units became a priority that competed with operational requirements. The paranoia that began to spread through Imperial command structures reflected the reality that the enemy now wore familiar faces and spoke with trusted voices. The communication of warnings to loyalist forces throughout the galaxy became a race against time, as Imperial commanders sought to alert their allies before the rebellion could spread further. The astropathic networks that connected Imperial worlds became conduits for desperate messages warning of the betrayal, though the unreliable nature of psychic communication meant that many warnings arrived too late or were distorted beyond recognition. The fragmentary nature of these communications created confusion and uncertainty that the traitors were quick to exploit. The establishment of new security protocols within loyalist forces reflected the harsh reality that traditional methods of ensuring loyalty were no longer adequate. The Warrior Lodge system was immediately banned throughout all Imperial military formations, while new procedures were implemented to identify and isolate potentially corrupted personnel. These measures, while necessary, created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that undermined the unity and effectiveness of Imperial forces at the very moment when such qualities were most desperately needed. The symbolic significance of Istvan III as the site of the first major battle of the Civil War ensured that the planet's name would be remembered throughout the conflict that followed. The massacre became a rallying cry for loyalist forces, a reminder of the price of betrayal and the necessity of absolute vigilance against corruption. The heroic last stand of the loyalist survivors, though ultimately unsuccessful, provided examples of courage and dedication that inspired Imperial forces throughout the galaxy to continue fighting despite seemingly impossible odds. The tactical lessons learned from the Istvan III massacre influenced the development of new military doctrines designed specifically for fighting against traitor Astartes. The effectiveness of the virus bombing demonstrated the need for improved protection against biological weapons, while the siege of the precentor's palace revealed the importance of defensive fortifications that could withstand assault by forces with identical capabilities. These lessons would prove crucial in the campaigns that followed, as loyalist forces adapted their tactics to counter the advantages that the traitors had gained through their willingness to employ forbidden weapons and tactics. The corruption of the astropathic networks by chaos influences became apparent as reports of the Istvan III massacre spread throughout the galaxy, with many psychic communications being intercepted or distorted by warp entities that served the ruinous powers. The reliability of long-range communication, already problematic due to the unpredictable nature of warp travel, deteriorated further as the influence of chaos grew stronger. This degradation of Imperial communication capabilities provided the traitors with additional advantages, as they could operate with greater secrecy while loyalist forces struggled to coordinate their responses. The industrial implications of losing the Istvan system extended beyond the immediate military casualties to encompass the destruction of manufacturing facilities and resource extraction operations that had supported Imperial expansion in the region. The complete sterilization of Istvan III eliminated production capabilities that would have been crucial for sustaining loyalist forces during the coming conflict, while the corruption of the system's other worlds denied the Imperium access to strategic materials and manufacturing expertise. The economic impact of these losses would be felt throughout the war, as both sides struggled to maintain their military capabilities while fighting across multiple fronts. The refugee crisis created by the Istvan III massacre was relatively limited due to the complete destruction of the planet's population, but the psychological impact on Imperial citizens throughout the galaxy was profound. The knowledge that entire worlds could be eliminated without warning challenged the fundamental assumptions about Imperial protection and security that had sustained civilian morale during the Great Crusade. The fear that any world might become the next target of traitor forces created an atmosphere of uncertainty that the rebellion's leaders were quick to exploit. The investigation of the Istvan III massacre by Imperial intelligence services revealed the sophistication of the conspiracy that had made the betrayal possible, exposing the extent to which chaos corruption had infiltrated the highest levels of Imperial military command. The warrior lodge networks were identified as the primary vector for this corruption, while the role of the word bearers in orchestrating the conspiracy became increasingly apparent. This intelligence would prove crucial in identifying other potentially compromised formations and preventing similar betrayals in the future. The memorial services held for the Istvan III victims throughout the loyalist forces served both to honor the dead and to reinforce the commitment to the Imperial cause that defined the ongoing resistance to Horus's rebellion. These ceremonies, conducted in the face of an uncertain future and against overwhelming odds, demonstrated the spiritual resilience that would sustain Imperial forces through the darkest years of the Civil War. The names of the fallen loyalists became sacred to their surviving brothers, while their sacrifice provided inspiration for the countless battles that lay ahead. The massacre at Istvan III carved a wound into the Imperial psyche that would never fully heal, establishing precedents and patterns that would define the relationship between loyalist and traitor forces for the next 10,000 years. The heroic last stand of Captains Loken, Tarvitz, and Torgeddon became foundational myths within Imperial military doctrine, their sacrifice transforming from historical fact into sacred legend that would inspire countless generations of warriors to come. The ecclesiarchy, rising to prominence in the millennia following the heresy, canonized these fallen heroes as martyrs whose deaths exemplified the ultimate expression of loyalty to the Emperor's divine will. Within the Adeptus Ministorum's vast cathedral libraries on Terra, illuminated manuscripts preserve detailed accounts of the loyalist resistance on Istvan III, though these texts have been heavily edited to emphasize their spiritual significance rather than tactical details. The The Lectitio Divinitatis, originally penned by Lorger before his fall, ironically became the theological framework through which the sacrifice of Istvan III's defenders was interpreted. The loyalist Astartes who died defending the precentor's palace were portrayed as warrior saints who chose martyrdom over the corruption that had claimed their fallen brothers, their deaths serving as proof of the emperor's divine nature and the spiritual rewards that awaited the faithful. The Feast of Martyrs, observed annually throughout the Imperium on the anniversary of the virus bombing, became one of the most solemn commemorations in the imperial calendar. On this day, Space Marine chapters across the galaxy conduct ceremonies of remembrance that blend military tradition with religious observance, reciting the names of the fallen while renewing their oaths of loyalty to the Emperor. The ritual typically begins before dawn with the lighting of memorial flames that burn throughout the day, each flame representing one of the major loyalist commanders who died on Istvan III's poisoned surface. The Space Marine chapters that trace their lineage to the loyalist survivors of Istvan III maintain particularly elaborate commemorative traditions that have evolved over 10 millennia of continuous observance. The Imperial Fist's successors, claiming spiritual descent from the defensive expertise demonstrated during the palace siege, conduct annual siege exercises where battle brothers must hold fortified positions against overwhelming odds using only limited ammunition supplies. These training scenarios deliberately recreate the desperate conditions faced by the loyalist defenders, forcing participants to experience a pale reflection of the resource constraints and tactical challenges that define the final days of resistance. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters have incorporated the tactical lessons of Istvan III into their comprehensive military doctrine, particularly regarding the identification and elimination of potential traitors within Imperial forces. The Codex Astartes, compiled by Robute Guilliman in the aftermath of the heresy, includes specific protocols for detecting signs of chaos corruption among Space Marine formations, drawing heavily on intelligence gathered from survivors of the massacre. These procedures emphasize the importance of maintaining strict discipline within chapter hierarchies, while monitoring for the kind of informal networks that allowed the warrior lodges to spread their influence. The Iron Hands and their successors developed perhaps the most extreme response to the Istvan legacy, viewing the betrayal as evidence of the fundamental weakness inherent in biological flesh and emotion. Their gradual replacement of organic components with cybernetic implants represents a systematic attempt to eliminate the psychological vulnerabilities that made corruption possible, though this approach has created its own problems as the chapters struggle to maintain their humanity while pursuing mechanical perfection. The Iron Hand's hatred of weakness extends to a particular loathing for any display of brotherhood or camaraderie that might echo the warrior lodge system. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters incorporated the memory of Istvan III into their existing struggles with the genetic flaws that plagued their gene seed, viewing the loyalist martyrs as examples of how even corrupted warriors could choose redemption through sacrifice. The Death Company, those battle brothers who have succumbed to the Black Rage, are often told stories of the Istvan defenders during their final preparations for battle, with chaplains emphasizing how even doomed warriors can serve the Emperor's will through their manner of dying. This connection between madness and martyrdom has become a central theme in Blood Angels theology. The Raven Guard's approach to commemorating Istvan III reflects their own traumatic experiences during the drop site massacre that followed, creating a shared understanding of betrayal and survival that bonds them spiritually to the earlier victims. Their emphasis on stealth and careful planning stems partly from lessons learned about the importance of operational security when facing enemies who possess intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics and capabilities. Raven Guard strike forces often conduct memorial raids against Chaos Space Marine positions on the anniversary of the massacre, viewing these attacks as a form of ongoing vengeance for the betrayals of the heresy. The strategic doctrine that emerged from analysis of the Istvan III atrocity fundamentally changed how Imperial forces approach the problem of internal security and loyalty verification. The Inquisition, established in the wake of the heresy, drew heavily on the lessons of the Warrior Lodge infiltration when developing their methods for detecting and eliminating chaos corruption within imperial institutions. The systematic nature of the betrayal demonstrated that traditional loyalty oaths and conditioning were insufficient protection against the insidious influence of the ruinous powers, leading to the development of more sophisticated psychological screening techniques. The Officio Assassinorum's Culexus Temple developed specialized protocols for eliminating corrupted space marines based on tactical intelligence gathered from the Istvan massacre, recognizing that conventional assassination techniques were inadequate against targets with enhanced physiology and superior equipment. The temple's operatives studied detailed accounts of how loyalist defenders were overwhelmed during the palace siege, identifying specific vulnerabilities that can be exploited when targeting traitor Astartes. These techniques have proven crucial in the ongoing war against Chaos Space Marine warbands that continue to plague the Imperium. The Adeptus Mechanicus incorporated the technological lessons of Istvan III into their ongoing development of anti-chaos countermeasures, particularly regarding the corruption of machine spirits and automated systems. The ease with which traitor forces had subverted the palace's defensive systems demonstrated the vulnerability of Imperial technology to chaos influence, leading to the development of more sophisticated protective protocols and purification rituals. Tech priests studying the massacre's aftermath identified specific patterns of machine spirit corruption that became the basis for improved detection and cleansing procedures. The Imperial Guard's tactical doctrine was revolutionized by the recognition that they might be called upon to fight against Space Marines, a possibility that had never been seriously considered during the Great Crusade. The development of specialized anti-Astartes equipment and tactics became a priority for Imperial military planners, leading to the creation of weapons and vehicles specifically designed to counter the advantages possessed by superhuman opponents. The Leman Russ Executioner, with its plasma cannon capable of penetrating power armor, became a standard component of Imperial Guard formations operating in regions where Chaos Space Marine activity was suspected. The hatred between loyalist Space Marines and their fallen brothers that began on Istvan III's burning surface has only intensified over 10 millennia of continuous warfare, becoming a defining characteristic of the relationship between the Imperium and the forces of chaos. This animosity goes beyond mere tactical opposition to encompass a spiritual revulsion that affects every aspect of how loyalist chapters approach combat against traitor Astartes. The knowledge that their enemies were once brothers who shared the same gene seed and training creates a form of existential horror that drives loyalist forces to extraordinary lengths in pursuing vengeance. The Black Templars exemplify this eternal hatred through their zealous pursuit of Chaos Space Marines across the galaxy, viewing the destruction of traitor Astartes as a sacred duty that takes precedence over all other considerations. Their eternal crusade has claimed thousands of traitor lives over the centuries, with each kill meticulously recorded in the chapter's chronicles as a small payment against the debt of betrayal incurred at Istvan III. The Black Templars' refusal to establish a permanent homeworld stems partly from their determination to maintain constant offensive operations against the forces of chaos. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters carry their own burden of shame regarding the heresy, but their pursuit of the fallen demonstrates how the legacy of Istvan III continues to shape Space Marine behavior 10,000 years later. The secretive nature of their hunt for corrupted battle brothers reflects the paranoia and mistrust that the massacre introduced into Imperial military culture, while their willingness to sacrifice Imperial interests in pursuit of their private war shows how the trauma of betrayal can distort even the most loyal servants of the Emperor. The Chaos Space Marines who participated in the Istvan III massacre have become legendary figures within the traitor legions, their names spoken with reverence by younger warriors who seek to emulate their ancestors' achievement in striking the first blow against the false emperor. The World Eaters' warband, known as the Skulltakers, claims direct descent from the assault troops who breached the Precentor's palace's final defenses, while several emperors' children warbands compete for the right to bear the names of the captains who led the massacre's most artistically brutal phases. The Death Guard's embrace of Nurgle's gifts transformed their relationship with the Istvan legacy, as their corruption by the plague god recontextualized their role in the massacre as the first step toward a greater understanding of decay and rebirth. The putrid champions who now lead Death Guard warbands view the virus bombing as a crude but necessary prelude to the more sophisticated plagues they now spread across Imperial worlds, while their rotting bodies serve as living monuments to the transformation that began with their rejection of the Emperor's sterile vision of human perfection. The Sons of Horus, now known as the Black Legion under Abaddon's leadership, have attempted to distance themselves from the specific details of the Istvan III massacre, while maintaining pride in their role as the architects of the heresy. The political necessities of leading a coalition of traitor forces have required Abaddon to downplay the fratricidal aspects of the massacre, while emphasizing its strategic importance as the opening move in humanity's liberation from imperial tyranny. This careful balance between acknowledgement and denial reflects the complex legacy that the massacre represents within Chaos Space Marine culture. The tactical innovations developed during the Istvan III siege have influenced Space Marine combat doctrine throughout the subsequent 10 millennia, with both loyalist and traitor forces incorporating lessons learned from the desperate fighting in the palace's ruins. The importance of controlling communication networks, the vulnerability of automated defense systems to corruption, and the psychological impact of fighting former brothers have all become standard considerations in Space Marine operational planning. The siege's demonstration that even the most heavily fortified positions could be overcome through sustained pressure and superior numbers led to significant changes in Imperial defensive architecture. The fortress monasteries constructed for Space Marine chapters in the centuries following the heresy incorporated design elements specifically intended to prevent the kind of systematic infiltration that had made the Istvan massacre possible. Multiple redundant communication systems, compartmentalized security protocols, and enhanced monitoring of internal activities became standard features of chapter facilities, while the physical layout of these structures was designed to limit the damage that corrupted personnel could inflict before being detected and eliminated. The development of new loyalty verification procedures within Space Marine chapters reflects the ongoing influence of the Istvan legacy on Imperial military culture. The chaplaincy, elevated to unprecedented prominence in the wake of the heresy, maintains constant vigilance for signs of corruption among their battle brothers, using techniques developed through careful study of how the warrior lodges had operated. Regular confession sessions, psychological evaluations, and monitoring of informal social networks have become routine aspects of chapter life, creating an atmosphere of controlled paranoia that serves as protection against chaos influence. The gene seed monitoring protocols established after the heresy were directly influenced by the systematic corruption of loyalist Astartes that had preceded the massacre, recognizing that genetic purity alone was insufficient protection against the influence of the ruinous powers. The careful screening of potential recruits, the monitoring of implantation procedures, and the regular testing of gene seed stocks all reflect lessons learned from the ease with which entire legions had been turned against the Emperor. These procedures have prevented several potential corruptions over the millennia, though their effectiveness comes at the cost of reduced recruitment rates and increased administrative burden. The librarium departments within Space Marine chapters maintain extensive archives documenting the Istvan III massacre, though access to these records is strictly controlled due to their sensitive nature. These documents serve multiple purposes, providing tactical intelligence about Chaos Space Marine capabilities, while also serving as cautionary tales about the consequences of corruption. Young Space Marines are required to study these accounts as part of their training, learning to recognize the warning signs that preceded the betrayal while developing the psychological resilience necessary to resist similar temptations. The ritual scarification practiced by many Space Marine chapters includes specific markings that commemorate the Istvan martyrs, with different patterns representing the various phases of the siege and the heroic actions of individual defenders. These scars serve as permanent reminders of the price of loyalty and the consequences of betrayal, while also providing a form of spiritual connection to the warriors who died defending the Emperor's vision. The pain involved in receiving these markings is considered a form of penance for the collective failure that allowed the heresy to begin. The Feast of Martyrs ceremonies conducted by Space Marine chapters have evolved into complex rituals that combine military precision with religious devotion, reflecting the dual nature of the Astartes as both warriors and warrior monks. The recitation of the names of the fallen is accompanied by the display of relics recovered from Istvan III's ruins, including fragments of armor, weapons, and personal effects that serve as tangible connections to the heroes of the past. These ceremonies reinforce chapter unity, while also serving as recruitment tools for new aspirants who witness the solemnity and dedication of the Space Marines. The strategic implications of the Istvan III massacre continue to influence Imperial military planning 10,000 years later, as the possibility of large-scale betrayal remains a constant concern for Imperial commanders. The development of contingency plans for dealing with corrupted Space Marine chapters, the maintenance of loyalist forces capable of engaging superhuman opponents, and the careful monitoring of chapter activities all reflect the ongoing impact of the lessons learned from humanity's first civil war. As the 41st millennium draws to a close and the galaxy burns with renewed conflict, the legacy of Istvan III remains as relevant as ever. The Great Rift has unleashed new waves of chaos corruption across Imperial space, while the return of Robute Guilliman has brought fresh urgency to the eternal struggle against the forces of darkness. The martyrs who died defending the Precentor's palace 10,000 years ago continue to inspire new generations of warriors, their sacrifice serving as proof that even in the darkest hours, loyalty and courage can triumph over corruption and despair. The names of Garvil Loken, Saul Tarvitz, and Tarek Torgeddon are spoken with reverence in chapter halls across the galaxy, their example providing hope to warriors facing impossible odds against the enemies of mankind. Their deaths on Istvan III's poisoned surface marked not just the end of their individual stories, but the beginning of a legend that has sustained the Imperium through 10 millennia of darkness. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, their memory burns eternal as a beacon of defiance against the forces that would see humanity destroyed. The betrayal that began on Istvan III may have shattered the dream of the Great Crusade, but the heroism displayed in its aftermath continues to light the way forward for those who remain loyal to the Emperor's vision of human unity and strength.